Amberville, Chapter 1, The Plan, Scene 1, Amberville Morning. The morning started like every other in Amberville, quiet, pale, and too still for a town that used to hum with life. The frost hadn't yet burned off the rooftops, and the mountains cast long shadows that sliced across Main Street. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent again. Raffi Ephraim stood at his bedroom window, mug of instant coffee cooling in his hand, watching his breath fog the glass. His mom's voice drifted up from the kitchen below, the sound of a radio playing KCOL 93.1 classic rock, the same songs she'd played when he was little: Fleetwood Mac, Tom Petty, Comfort, and Static. He looked down at the driveway where the old Chrysler minivan waited. Silver, boxy, scratched. His entire week had been built around that van. Everything they'd need was already stacked in the garage. Tents, sleeping bags, a cooler, the maps he'd printed from the library computer. He told himself it wasn't just a camping trip. It was something more. A break. A chance to start feeling like life wasn't going to slip by and leave him behind in Amberville. He sat on the edge of his bed, tying his boots. The walls around him were cluttered: cassette cases, faded posters, a Polaroid packed above his desk. He didn't look at the photo much anymore, but he knew every detail of it. 2 kids on a swing set, muddy shoes, her hand clutching his wrist. Daphne Silver. He'd forgotten she was still pinned up there. The phone rang downstairs. His mom answered, her voice soft through the floorboards. Raffi finished his coffee, slung on his jacket, and grabbed his duffel. He paused at the door and looked back once more. The photo, the small stack of tapes, the postcard he'd never mailed. "Be back Sunday," he muttered. "Promise." Amberville, Chapter 1, The Plan Scene. 2, Packing and Gathering the Crew. By the time Raffi got outside, the frost had turned to dew. The air had that thin, high-altitude clarity that made sound carry. The rustle of trees, a crow somewhere off toward the ridgeline, and the faint hum of an engine that didn't belong to his. The minivan sat crooked in the drive, already half-packed. His mom leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed over her flannel nightshirt, watching him with that mixture of affection and quiet worry she'd perfected since his dad left. "You're sure you've got enough gas?" she asked. "Filled it last night," Raffi said, checking the rear hatch again just to be certain. "Oil too. Tires. We're good." She smiled faintly. "You always were the careful one." He zipped his jacket, avoiding her eyes. "Yeah, well, someone's got to be." "Be careful out there, Raffi." "I will." She nodded toward the van. "You tell Mark not to drive too fast, and don't go near that old reserve past Pike Ridge. You know what people say." He laughed softly. "Yeah, ghost stories." Her expression didn't change. "Just stay in sight of the trails, okay?" He almost said something, a joke maybe, but instead just nodded. He hugged her quickly, the kind of hug that ends before it really begins, and climbed into the driver's seat. "This is an announcement for the Wimmerland Motor Races." Mark arrived first, right on cue, the roar of his father's Bronco echoing down the street. He parked sideways, jumped out with his usual grin, and dropped a duffel at Raffi's feet. "Morning, sunshine. Ready to see the world?" Raffi popped the rear door. "Depends which world you mean." "The one with no parents, no work, and nothing but beer and pine trees." "Sounds temporary." Mark laughed. "Everything good is." He tossed his cooler into the van with a thud. Inside, something clinked. Raffi gave him a look. "Relax," Mark said. It's mostly water. Mostly. This. Steve showed up next, wearing headphones and chewing sunflower seeds, half asleep in his faded Metallica shirt. "You guys started without me?" he mumbled, climbing in. "You're lucky we didn't leave you," Mark said. Steve ignored him, flopped into the back seat, and looked out the window. "I had a weird dream last night," he said suddenly. "Like, about water, flooding everything. Couldn't see anything but reflections." Rafi smiled faintly. "You eat chili before bed again?" "Probably." Do not read the tag. Jerry was last, her little Honda coughing up the street. She parked crooked, killed the engine, and stepped out with her camera slung around her neck. "Don't say it," she warned. "Say what?" Rafi said. "That I'm late." "You're not late," Mark said, grinning. "You're dramatic." She gave him a look sharp enough to cut. "Someone's got to make this." Rafi tried not to smile. Jerry had always been the quiet pulse of the group, sharper than any of them, more observant. She noticed things others didn't, remembered details that mattered only later. As she tossed her bag in the van, she looked up at the mountains and said, "Feels different today." Steve snorted. "It's called weather." "No," she said softly, "different." The group fell silent for a moment. Even Mark, who usually filled any silence with noise, seemed to sense the shift. The sky had taken on a faint haze. Sunlight diffused through thin cloud. The smell of pine felt sharper somehow, like static in the air. Rafi shut the van door, forcing a grin. "All right, team, let's roll before the mountain decides otherwise." Mark whooped. "Now we're talking." The van rumbled to life, exhaust puffing into the cool morning. Rafi backed down the drive, waving once at his mom, who stood on the porch with her coffee, a small figure watching them vanish around the corner. The broom. As the van rolled past the diner and the hardware store, the town looked smaller than he remembered, a map folding in on itself. "Last chance to back out," Jerry said, snapping a Polaroid of the van's reflection in a storefront window. Mark leaned back. "You kidding? We gonna make history." Steve raised an eyebrow. "Camping history?" "Nah," Mark said. "Amberville history. People'll talk about this trip for years." Rafi smiled thinly, eyes on the road. Somehow, he already knew they would. Amberville, Chapter 1, The Plan Scene, 3, Daphne's Echo, Extended Version. They were 20 minutes outside town when the forest began to close in. Amberville fell away behind them, its rooftops shrinking to specks between the pines until there was nothing but asphalt, sky, and trees that leaned too close together. The van climbed in slow, steady turns, following the mountain's shoulder, the sunlight breaking in pale, fractured strips through the branches. For a long time, nobody talked. The old cassette deck chewed on Mark's mixtape until it spit out silence, leaving only the hum of tires and the restless creak of the van's suspension. Every now and then the wind would rush through the cracked window, carrying that thin alpine scent, pine, cold stone, and something metallic beneath it all. Mark finally broke the quiet. "Man, this place feels ancient, like people shouldn't still be driving here." "Maybe they don't," Steve muttered, flicking sunflower seed shells into an empty cup. Rafi glanced at the clock. They'd only been gone 40 minutes, but already the town felt weeks away. Jerry pressed her Polaroid camera to the glass and took a shot of the road curling ahead. "You ever get that feeling," she said, "like you're being watched, but not by a person?" Mark laughed. Yeah, by you with that damn camera. She didn't smile. I'm serious. It's like this place is looking back. Raffi didn't say anything. He knew exactly what she meant. The road bent again, and suddenly the forest fell open on one side. A narrow stretch of clearing where a dirt drive cut through the undergrowth. At its mouth, leaning half-collapsed into the ditch, was a rusted mailbox. The letters were barely visible under the grime, but enough remained to spell one name. Silver. The breath caught in Raffia's throat. He hadn't meant to slow down, but his foot eased off the gas. The van rolled to a crawl. Mark frowned. "Why are we stopping?" Raffia's voice came out low. That's Daphne's place." No one spoke for a long moment. The house crouched at the end of the drive, mostly hidden by the trees. Its siding was gray and swollen, the windows boarded from the inside. One shutter hung by a single hinge, banging softly in the wind. The air seemed heavier here, as if sound itself didn't want to carry. "I thought it burned down," Steve said finally. Raffi shook his head. "No, her dad got sick. After that, she just—" He stopped, eyes fixed on the broken porch. "She just wasn't the same." Jerry leaned forward, squinting through the dirty glass. "You two were close, right?" He nodded. "In kindergarten, yeah. We used to walk to school together. She liked to draw, trees mostly. Always the same kind, long roots spiraling down. She said the ground here had memories." Mark gave a low whistle. "That's creepy as hell." Raffi smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She said they whisper if you listen long enough." "Whisper what?" Jerry asked. Raffi didn't answer. "Do not read the tag. Do not read outside the tag." The van idled quietly. A crow screamed somewhere up the ridge. Then, movement. Raffi saw it out of the corner of his eye, a flicker behind the boards of the second-story window, like something pale shifting in the shadows. He blinked, heart hammering, and it was gone. "Hey," Mark said, "you good at?" Raffi forced his hand back to the gear shift. Yeah. He pressed the pedal. The van lurched forward, gravel spitting from under the tires. "Time taker." As they passed the house, Jerry raised her camera. The flash went off, stark against the trees. The photo spat out a moment later, curling slightly in the mountain air. "Why'd you take that?" Steve asked. "I don't know," she said, watching the image fade into view. "It felt like the right thing to do." Raffi tried not to look at the photo as it developed in her lap, but from the corner of his eye, he caught the pale outline of the old house and something else, faint, just behind the porch. A shape, small, still, watching. He rolled up his window. The air inside the van was suddenly too cold. And then, from somewhere beyond the hum of the tires, a whisper, soft as breath, almost buried in the static of memory. "Raffi!" He looked in the mirror. The house was gone, but the name still rang in his head, clear as the voice of a child. Amberville, Chapter 1, The Plan Scene. 4, Departure. Expanded, The Storm Builds. The weather changed almost imperceptibly at first. One minute, the air was sharp and dry, mountain clean. The next, it was heavy, dense with that metallic taste that came just before a storm. The light dimmed without warning, as if the clouds were folding over the sun. Shadows lengthened, and the forest went quiet in that eerie, collective way nature does when it knows something's coming. The van climbed higher into the foothills. Behind them, Amberville vanished into a slate-gray haze. Ahead, the ridges stacked like frozen waves, one behind another, swallowed in mist. The temperature dropped so suddenly that the windows fogged from the inside. "Geez," Mark said, wiping a circle clear with his sleeve. "It's like we drove into a fridge." "Cold front," Rafi said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. The trees on either side of the road leaned closer, their tops swaying in unison. The pines creaked, and every so often one of them shed a handful of water like a sudden exhale. The smell of wet bark filled the van, earthy, electric. A flash of lightning spidered across the clouds far to the east, followed by the deep, slow growl of thunder. The sound rolled down the slopes like something waking up. Steve looked up from his seeds. "That didn't sound far." Rafi nodded. "Storms crossing the ridge line." Mark smirked. "Let it. We're waterproof." But a second boat cracked closer this time, bright enough to illuminate the whole forest, the trunks, the underbrush, even the pale dirt road where the asphalt had long since given up. When it faded, the world felt darker than before. Jerry exhaled softly. "It's like the light's dying." "Just clouds," Mark said, forcing a laugh. "It'll blow over." Rafi didn't answer. His fingers were tight around the steering wheel. Every drop that hit the windshield seemed louder, sharper, the rhythm uneven, like a pulse that couldn't decide its pace. "Don't read the tag." By the time they reached the overlook, the wind had picked up. It came in gusts, rushing down from the peaks, carrying fine, cold rain that stung their faces when they stepped out. Below them, the valley looked half-drowned, fog filling the low places like water. The trees shimmered, their tops bending as the storm approached from the west. Jerry's hair whipped across her face as she raised her camera. She snapped a picture just as lightning struck somewhere miles away, lighting the whole valley white. The photo slid out, the image faint and ghostly. She stared at it as the outlines formed. Mountains, trees, and, faintly in the distance, something tall and thin, like a figure at the edge of the clearing. She blinked. When she looked again, it was gone. Rafi leaned against the van, watching the horizon. Storm's closing fast. Steve zipped up his jacket. "We should move before it hits." Mark tossed his empty can into the cooler and grinned. "Come on, man. A little water never killed anybody." "Lightning has," Jerry said. That shut him up. Text, blessed. As they started driving again, the rain came in earnest. Thick drops hammered the windshield, blurring the trees into smears of dark green and gray. The wipers worked furiously, the squeak and thump of their rhythm the only sound above the storm. The air smelled of ozone now, sharp, charged, alive. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, echoing through the mountains. It wasn't a single clap, but a series of them, overlapping, like something enormous moving under the clouds. The vibration passed through the metal of the van, through their bones. "Jesus," Mark muttered, That one shook the ground. Raffi said nothing. He could feel the storm pressing down, like the air itself was thicker, heavier, like it was watching. Out the passenger window, lightning illuminated the slopes. For an instant, the trees looked like black ribs against the sky. Then darkness again. "Feels like we're being followed," Jerry whispered, almost to herself. No one replied. "Don't read bis." They passed the sign then, half rotted, split down the middle by a fallen branch. "Pike Hollow Reserve, 2 miles." Rain streaked over the letters like blood over old wood. The van rattled across the uneven road, headlights cutting through sheets of water. The forest grew thicker, the canopy pressing down. The storm seemed to have rooted itself above them, lightning flashing in near silence, the thunder delayed like a heart skipping beats. When the next bolt hit, Raffi caught something in the light, a clearing off the side of the road, scorched and bare. In its center, an old signpost carved with a spiral. He blinked. The image was gone, but he could still smell it. The burnt air, the copper tang of rain on soil. "Our main goal." Lightning forked across the road ahead, striking a dead pine. The crack was so loud it felt physical. The tree burst in a shower of sparks and fell into the ditch. The van fishtailed as Raffi swerved, heart hammering. "Holy!" Mark grabbed the dash. "Got it," Raffi said through gritted teeth, steadying the wheel. No one spoke after that. The storm had fully claimed the world outside. And somewhere behind them, deep in the mist, a figure stood at the roadside, still, watching, waiting. Amberville, Chapter 2, The Road, Scene 3, Nightfall, a wonderful start. Not a click, not a crack. The night was silent and serene. A wonderful start. For the first time since morning, the rain had eased. Not stopped, but softened to a mist that clung to the tents and glimmered under the faint light of their lanterns. The forest breathed in quiet rhythm. Somewhere far off, water trickled through roots and rocks, the sound almost musical. The group sat in a rough circle around the small camp lantern. Its glow was a soft gold that made their faces look younger, softer, like they'd stepped out of time. The wet air smelled of pine, smoke, and earth. Mark leaned back on his elbows, beer in hand, staring up at the canopy. "See? Told you this was gonna be worth it." Steve smirked. "Yeah, if you ignored a hypothermia." Adds character. Raffi smiled faintly, staring at the mist hovering between the trees. "I'll give it this much. It's quiet. Haven't heard a car in hours." Jerry adjusted her camera strap, resting it against her knees. "Or anything else," she said softly. The forest really was silent. No insects, no frogs, not even the distant call of a night bird. Just the faint drip of rain and the occasional sigh of wind through the branches. "Guess everything's asleep," Steve said. "Guess so," Raffi said, but part of him didn't believe it. "All right." They ate what passed for dinner, sandwiches, chips, and more of Mark's contraband beer. The lantern flickered as the wind shifted, throwing shadows that rippled across the tents and the trees. For a moment, it felt like the world outside that small circle of light didn't exist, like they were the only ones left. Mark started telling stories, high school ones, stupid ones. The kind of stories that only mattered to the people who were there, and even then, just barely. The laughter was easy, the kind that comes from tired bodies and good company. Steve threw a pine cone at him at one point, missing completely. Jerry took a picture just as it hit the dirt, and they all cracked up again. For that one brief hour, everything was perfect. The rain, the road, the long day. It all dissolved into the simple rhythm of friends sharing warmth in the cold. It wasn't until much later, when the lantern burned low and the laughter had faded, that Raffi noticed the mist again. It had thickened while they talked, creeping closer from the trees, curling low, pale and smooth as smoke. He rubbed his eyes. Maybe it was just the light, or the beer, or exhaustion. "Hey," Jerry said quietly, noticing his gaze. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Just thought I saw something." "Where?" He gestured vaguely toward the woods. "There, between those trees." They both stared. Nothing moved, just fog, steady and soft. "Probably steam," she said after a moment. He nodded. "Yeah, probably." "Good morning." The night stayed silent. No click, no crack. When they finally crawled into their tents, the rain began again, thin, constant, gentle. It wasn't the sound that kept Raffi awake. It was the pattern of it, steady, almost deliberate, like fingers on canvas. Amberville, Chapter 2. The road, the rain keeps pouring. The storm never left. It didn't rage the way storms do in movies, no screaming wind or lightning apocalypse. It just stayed, relentless, soaking, a curtain of cold water that blurred the world into grays and motion. The road had turned to a dark river of mud and broken pavement, tire grooves filling and draining in endless rhythm. The wipers fought to keep up, thumping back and forth with mechanical desperation. Inside the van, it was warm but heavy, a cocoon of breath, damp clothes, and the steady sound of rain drumming on the roof. Mark had found an old mix CD wedged in the glove compartment. Amberville High Classics. The handwriting was Raffi's from years ago. He popped it in, and the speakers hissed before breaking into a thin, warbling guitar riff. "Oh my God," Steve groaned. "Is that third eye blind?" Mark laughed. "Damn right it is. Peak art." Jerry rolled her eyes, but smiled despite herself. "I swear you were born 30 years too late, Mark." "Hey, nostalgia's eternal." He drummed on the dash to the beat, singing off-key. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal. The storm outside was just weather again. Inconvenient, but harmless. Raffi even started tapping his fingers on the wheel. They tore open their stash of Walmart snacks. Jerky, chips, energy drinks, candy that already stuck together in the humidity. The air filled with the smell of salt, sugar, and laughter. "All right," Mark said between bites. "Top 3 camping horror movies. Go." "Easy," Steve said. "Evil Dead, The Ritual, Cabin in the Woods." Jerry shook her head. "That's cheating. Cabin in the Woods doesn't count." "Why not?" "Because it knows it's a movie. You have to pick something that believes in itself." Mark pointed at her. "Spoken like a true weirdo." She grinned. "You mean artist." "Same thing." Raffi smiled faintly, keeping his eyes on the road. "You guys ever notice how all those movies start with people laughing in cars?" The van went quiet for a moment. Mark broke it. "Yeah, Well, good thing none of us are hot college kids. That got a laugh. Now, the rain grew heavier. The wipers could barely keep up now. The road narrowed until the trees on either side formed tunnels of dripping green. The sound of the rain on leaves was deafening. Steve leaned forward. "How much longer, Raph?" "Should be another 20 minutes, Rafi said. "If the trail map's right," Mark chuckled. "You keep saying that." "Yeah," Rafi said. "I keep hoping it'll be true." They rounded a curve, and the van jolted hard, a sharp thunk followed by a grinding hiss.
Shit! Rafi slammed the brakes.
The van fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop. Rain poured down the windshield in sheets. "What the hell was that?" Mark said. "Flat," Rafi muttered. He could already feel the slump of the van. "Perfect," Steve sighed. "Middle of nowhere. Middle of a storm." Mark grinned, trying to keep it light. "Could be worse. Could be snow." Jerry pulled her hood up. "Let's just fix it." "This is what are you doing?" The rain was colder than they expected, icy, almost metallic. Within seconds, they were drenched. The air smelled like wet bark and oil from the road. Mark and Rafi pulled out the jack and the spare. Jerry and Steve wandered a few yards up the road, hands shoved in their pockets. The rain hit the asphalt like static. "It's actually kind of beautiful," Jerry said, squinting into the trees. Steve shrugged. "If you like being soggy." "No, I mean," she gestured at the mountains hidden behind the mist. "Look at it. The color, the shape. It's like being inside a painting." He followed her gaze. The fog twisted between the trees, moving strangely, like it had weight, like it was aware of them. Then, faintly, a rustle. "Probably a deer," he said quickly. She nodded. "Yeah, deer." But neither of them moved closer. Still, by the time the spare was on, the rain had somehow gotten heavier. They piled back into the van, shivering, laughing at their own misery. Rafi slammed the door and wiped his face. "We're soaked." "Adds character," Mark said. "Think of it as part of the adventure." "Yeah," Jerry said softly, staring out the fogged window. "Adventure." Her tone was somewhere between a joke and something else. The van started again, tires hissing on the wet road. Behind them, where they'd stopped, the water pooled in the tire tracks. The rain blurred the ground, and if someone had looked close enough, they might have seen the faint outline of bare footprints among the puddles. Amberville, Chapter 3, The Morning After, Expanded Cinematic Edition. The rain finally broke. When Rafi woke, the silence hit him first. No patter on the tent roof, no hiss of drizzle. Just stillness, crisp and clean, the kind that only comes after a storm has wrung the sky dry. He unzipped the tent and blinked against the light. The forest shimmered. Every leaf was jeweled with droplets. Steam rose from the soil in soft curls. It was colder than he expected, that early morning mountain chill, but the air tasted alive. He grinned. "We made it," he murmured. Mark was crouched by the fire pit, coaxing wet wood to smoke. "Morning, Sleeping Beauty." Rafi groaned. "What time is it?" "Too early for jokes, not early enough for coffee." "Perfect." Steve stumbled out next, barefoot and bleary-eyed, hair sticking out like static. "It's bright," he said, squinting at the trees. "Yeah," Mark said. feels illegal. Jerry appeared last, camera in hand, hair still messy but eyes sharp. She raised it, clicked once. You all look like a tourism ad for hangovers. Good morning to you too, Mark said. This is Are You Ready to Play? By mid-morning, they'd found rhythm again. Coffee bubbled in a dented pot over the rekindled fire. Breakfast was granola bars and shared cigarettes. Jerry wandered the clearing snapping photos. Tents glistening, steam on the ground, light spilling like gold syrup through the trees. Mark stretched, cracked open a beer. This, he said, raising it like a toast, is the good life. Steve snorted. We've been here less than a day and you're already day drinking? Hydration, Mark said, in liquid form. Rafi shook his head but smiled. The mood felt easy again. The storm felt like a bad dream they'd already forgotten. Jerry sat beside him. Feels like the forest's forgiven us, she said. Rafi nodded. For what? Existing, probably. They laughed. This is not all there is. It wasn't until they started cleaning up breakfast that Jerry noticed the footprints. Guys? She was standing near the edge of the clearing, camera in hand, staring at the ground. The others joined her. The prints weren't deep, just faint impressions in the wet mud. Barefoot, human. The toes were splayed oddly wide, and the heels sank deeper than normal, like whoever made them was heavy or leaning forward. Mark frowned. One of us? None of us took our shoes off, Steve said. Rafi crouched down. They're fresh. Sides are sharp. Jerry bit her lip. So someone was here last night? Maybe a hiker, Mark said, but his tone lacked conviction. The prints led toward the tree line, then disappeared where the ground rose and dried. Beyond that, just ferns and shadow. Steve whistled low. Creepy. Yeah, Rafi said. Let's not think about it too hard. Jerry lifted her camera and took a single photo. Why? Steve asked. Because I don't trust memory, she said. Nah. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the heat turned the damp air thick, Mark wandered downhill toward the creek to wash the coffee pot. The water ran fast, churning with leftover runoff from the storm. It was cold and clear, the kind of mountain stream you could drink from. He crouched, dunked a pot, and waited for the sediment to swirl out. Something pale brushed against the rim. He frowned. A fish, small, belly up. Another drifted by, and another. Then more, 5, 6, a dozen. The current carried them in lazy circles, fins fluttering. Mark's stomach tightened. Oh, hell. He called out over his shoulder, Hey, Jerry, you seeing this? Long. Jerry was farther upstream, crouched near a patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy. Her camera clicked rhythmically. Droplets on branches, ripples in the water, light on moss. Then she saw it. At first, it looked like a bundle of wet leaves caught between roots. Then the wind shifted, and she saw fur. And blood. It was a squirrel. Its small body stretched unnaturally flat. The chest was split open clean, not torn like a predator would, not chewed, opened as if by hands. Its tiny arms were extended outward, the paws stiff, symmetrical. Its eyes were gone. Her stomach turned. Mark, she called, don't come over here. Too late. Raffi and Steve came down behind her, drawn by her tone. "What is—" Mark stopped mid-step. "Jesus Christ!" Raffi knelt slowly, the mud squelching under his boots. "It's fresh," he said quietly. "No rot yet." Steve shook his head. "That's not normal. A hawk, maybe?" "Hawk doesn't lay things out like that," Jerry said. "Maybe. Coyotes." "In the middle of the bay?" They all looked down again. The smell was faint but sharp, coppery, wet, metallic. Mark's voice dropped. "Storm runoff. Chemicals. Maybe the fish, too. Poison in the water." "Maybe," Raffi said, but he didn't sound sure. "Takes in square brackets and reject." They buried the squirrel under a flat stone by the creek. No one said a word. Back at camp, the laughter came slower. The air felt heavier again, the sunlight dimming, even though the clouds hadn't moved. Steve threw another log on the fire. "So we just forget it, right? Animals die." "Yeah," Mark said. "Circle of life." Jerry stared into the flames. "Sure," she said softly. "Circle of life." Do not read anything outside the tag. By late afternoon, the warmth returned. Mark cracked another beer. Steve started joking again. They talked half-heartedly until it all began to sound normal again. But the smell, faint, metallic, wrong, never quite went away. Sometimes it came with the wind, brushing the air for just a second. And every now and then, Raffi swore he could hear the creek. Not the water, something under it. A low, steady sound, like breath through hollow wood. He didn't mention it. The day was too good for that. Amberville, Chapter 3, The Morning After, Scene 2, Something in the Creek. The day stayed bright, but something about the light felt different now. It wasn't golden anymore. It had gone thin, washed out, pale, like sunlight through smoke. Mark was the first to notice the smell. He'd followed the sound of water down the slope behind their campsite, hoping to find a good spot to rinse the coffee pot. The creek ran fast and shallow, swollen from the night's rain. The surface glimmered silver in the sun. He crouched by the bank and dipped the pot in. The water looked clear at first, until something brushed against the rim. A pale shape. Then another. He leaned closer. Fish. 4 or 5 of them. Small trout, all belly up. Their scales caught the light, gleaming like coins. Some drifted against the reeds, tails twitching faintly with the current. Their eyes were cloudy, mouths half open. "Gross," he muttered. "What the hell?" He splashed the water, trying to push them away, but more floated into view. The creek curved farther upstream, and there were dozens now, maybe more. The current whispered over them, soft and endless. "Now I will allow tests." Jerry was nearby, maybe 50 feet upstream, taking pictures of the light through the trees. She crouched to get a shot of the creek bed, moss, roots, reflection, and that's when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a clump of leaves, but the color was wrong. Too red. It was a squirrel, or what was left of one. The fur on its back was matted and torn. Its chest was split open. Not shredded, not crushed, but opened, like something had studied it. Its tiny paws were stretched stiff in opposite directions, as if placed that way. Jerry's stomach turned. She lifted her camera out of reflex, then lowered it immediately.
"Mark?" she called out.
He looked up. "Yeah? Don't come up here." Raffi, hearing her tone, came running from the clearing. "What is it?" She pointed without speaking. He froze when he saw it. The body was half in the mud, half in the grass, perfectly framed in the sunlight. Flies already buzzed faintly around the torn fur. Steve joined them a moment later, crunching through the wet underbrush. "Jesus!" Mark caught up behind, breathing hard. "What's going on?" Raffi pointed downstream. "Fish. Dead ones. A lot of them." Mark swore under his breath. "Storm runoff. Maybe chemicals? There's mines around here, right?" "Could be," Steve said. "Lightning strike in the water, maybe." Jerry looked up at him. "Lightning doesn't gut squirrels." No one answered. Do not read the tag. The smell was worse now. Not rot exactly, but sharp, metallic, like blood and wet stone. The kind of smell that stays in the throat. Raffi stepped closer to the squirrel, squatting low. The mud around it was darker, thick with water and something that wasn't quite mud. He touched the ground beside it, still wet, but cold. He stood up slowly. "Let's go back." Mark nodded, already turning away. Jerry hesitated, then took one quick photo. The shutter sounded too loud. "Why'd you do that?" Steve asked. "Because nobody's going to believe it," she said quietly. "This is how I do my homework." They walked back in silence, the forest suddenly too bright, too open. By the time they reached camp, the breeze had shifted. The smell carried with it, faint and sour, until it was impossible to tell where it came from. The creek still ran. The birds still sang. The world looked exactly the same. But the air had changed, heavy again, charged with something invisible. Something that felt like waiting. Amberville, Chapter 3, The Morning After a Great Day. Morning came soft and clean. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the forest washed and glimmering. Droplets hung from every branch like glass beads. The air was cold but bright, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. Sunlight filtered through the trees in weak gold shafts, cutting through the mist that still drifted close to the ground. Raffi blanked awake to that silence, not heavy or foreboding this time, just still, peaceful. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The sound of birds broke the quiet, tentative at first, then building until it was a chorus. He smiled, stretched, and unzipped the tent flap. Outside, the world looked new. Mark was already up, squatting by the fire pit and coaxing a small flame out of damp wood. Steam rose from his shoulders where his shirt clung to him. "Morning, sunshine," he said without looking up. Steve emerged next, hair sticking out in every direction. "It's not raining," he said, disbelief in his voice. "Miracles do happen," Mark said. Jerry came last, camera already in hand. "Don't jinx it," she said, snapping a picture of the clearing. The lens caught the light, a flare of orange against the gray-green trees. "This lighting's perfect." Raffi joined her, hands in his pockets. "Feels like we made it through something." "You sound dramatic," she said, smiling. "Maybe," he said, still true. "Look at that!" Breakfast was slow and lazy. Granola bars, coffee that tasted faintly of smoke, and laughter that came easy again. The forest felt different in daylight, open, friendly even. Mark leaned back against a log, eyes half closed. "This is it," he said. "This is the dream. Forget jobs, forget rent, just trees and fire and bad coffee."
Steve threw a twig at him. "You wouldn't last a week without Wi-Fi."
Mark grinned. "Sure I would. I'd just talk to myself more." "That's not better," Jerry said. They laughed again. It felt good, unforced. Even Rafi let himself laugh, his guard finally lowering. It wasn't until they started cleaning up that anyone noticed the footprints. Jerry saw them first, near the edge of the clearing. "Hey," she said, "did one of you go walking last night?" They gathered around. The prints were faint, half filled with rainwater. Not boots, barefoot, wide set, deep enough to show toes pressed into the mud. "Must be one of ours," Mark said, crouching. Rafi frowned. "We all wore shoes." Steve knelt beside him. "Maybe an animal?" Jerry shook her head. "No pads, no claws, just feet." The prints led into the trees and vanished a few yards in. The mud there was churned up, darker than it should have been, streaked with something that looked almost like rust. "Probably iron in the soil," Mark said quickly, too quickly. Rafi nodded, but didn't answer. The pigs? They went back to their chores. The sun climbed higher. The warmth returned. By noon, it really did feel like a good day again, the kind you'd take pictures of and forget the unease that came before. Mark fished in the creek, Steve made a second fire, Jerry wandered off with her camera, and Rafi sat under a tree carving shapes into a stick with his pocket knife. He should have been relaxed. He wanted to be. But the smell lingered. Faint, metallic, wrong, like pennies and rainwater. Every so often, the wind would shift, carrying it past again. He looked at the trees and thought. He saw something dark against the light, a shadow, maybe, or just the memory of the mist. Then Jerry called his name from the ridge, her voice bright and easy. And for a moment, everything really was perfect again. Amberville, Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. Scene 1, as last night's embers failed to the darkness. As last night's embers failed to the darkness, the forest exhaled. Long, slow, and cold. What little light the fire gave was swallowed by the damp, leaving only the faintest orange pulse inside the black. The laughter that had filled the clearing hours ago was gone now, drifting somewhere between memory and dream. The empty beer cans gleamed dull silver under the dying coals. Rafi stirred first. He couldn't sleep. The air felt wrong again. Heavier, thicker, the kind that pressed against the lungs. Each time he closed his eyes, he swore he heard something shift in the trees. Not loud, just movement. A breath of wind? A branch giving way? He couldn't tell. He sat up, rubbing his face, and looked toward the tents. The others were still, shapes in the dim fire glow. Somewhere, a single raindrop hit the tarp, then another. The smell of rain and ash mixed in the air. This is, how do you keep your plants? Morning came pale and uncertain. The fire was out. The ground was soft and cold. Their boots sunk deep when they moved. The storm that had threatened yesterday had gathered somewhere over the ridge, a dark smear against the otherwise bright sky. "Feels like it's coming back," Steve said, zipping his jacket. "Yeah," Mark said. "Whole mountain smells like rain again." Jerry didn't answer. She was staring into the ashes, camera in her lap. The lens was fogged over, but she hadn't bothered to wipe it clean.
Rafi crouched beside her. "You good?"
She nodded slowly. "I dreamt something weird," she said, "like whispering." He waited. She shook her head. "Forget it. Just a dream." He didn't push it. Dawn, dawn, dawn. They tried to pack up early, but the sky moved faster than they did. By the time they finished loading the van, the light had gone strange, too yellow, too heavy, like it was thick with dust. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, long and low. Mark laughed nervously. "Guess the forest isn't done with us yet." "Guess not," Rafi said. The breeze carried that familiar metallic tang again. Jerry stopped mid-step, looking toward the creek below. "Do you smell that?" "Yeah," Steve said. "Same as yesterday." They followed her gaze. The creek was still, darker now, black in places where the light didn't reach. Something rippled the surface. Then, still, "This is bananas." They stood in silence, listening. Nothing, just the hum of distant thunder and the occasional pop of cooling metal from the van's hood. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. Mark cleared his throat. "Let's just get out before the rain hits." They nodded, but Rafi didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the water. Because, for a second, just one, he thought he saw something below the surface. Not a reflection, not a ripple. A face, pale and wrong, turned upward as if it had been waiting there, and when he blanked, it was gone. Amberville, Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. Scene 2, Nothing Could hold its breath that long. The rain came back the way a wound reopens. At first, just a few drops, soft, scattered tapping the leaves above. Then a shift in the wind, and the sky cracked open like a fault. Line. Water poured down in sheets, hammering the tents, flattening the grass, drowning the sound of everything else. Mark ran for the fire pit, cursing. "All that work!" he yelled, kicking at the embers as they hissed out. "Forget the fire!" "Steve!" shouted over the downpour. "Get the gear!" They scrambled, tossing sleeping bags and clothes into the van. Everything slick and heavy. The ground had turned to mud again, sucking at their boots. Rafi slipped once, catching himself on the bumper. His palms were streaked brown with wet ash. He wiped them on his jeans, but it only smeared. The rain didn't let up. It felt angry. "Hi." By the time they piled into the van, the storm had swallowed the forest. Whole. Wind bent the trees in long arcs, and lightning flashed behind. The clouds just a flicker of white through the endless gray. Mark twisted the key. The engine coughed. Then nothing. He tried again. "Come on." The van clicked uselessly. "Seriously?" Steve muttered. "Now?" Mark slammed the steering wheel. It was fine yesterday. Jerry hugged her knees in the back seat. "We'll wait it out," she said. "Storms don't last forever." Thunder answered her, a long, rolling growl that rattled the doors. Rafi stared out the fogged window. Through the rain, the trees looked closer than they had before, pressing in around the clearing. The water pooled at their bases, rippling in strange patterns, almost like movement. This is hello. An hour passed. The rain softened but never stopped. They were quiet now, the tension settling like weight on their shoulders. Mark drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Steve chewed the inside of his cheek, and Jerry just stared out her window. Camera clutched to her chest. Then something moved. It wasn't lightning this time, not wind. Just for a second, Rafi thought he saw a shape between the trees. Tall, narrow, moving against the rain. It vanished as soon as the next. "Flash it." He blinked hard, rubbed the fog off the glass. Nothing there. But when the thunder rolled again, the sound seemed to carry a half-second too long, like an echo, deep and hollow, from somewhere beneath the earth. "Hi." "I think it's letting up," Mark said, though it wasn't. He opened the door anyway, stepping out into the mist. "Mark," Rafi started, but he was already gone, squinting through the downpour toward the creek. The water had risen nearly to the edge now, rushing fast and black. Trees leaned over it like watchers. Mark called back, "Hey, look at this." Lightning flashed, and Rafi saw him clearly for just a heartbeat. Standing knee-deep near the bank, his reflection shimmering in the current. Then something moved below that reflection. It wasn't clear, just pale, almost colorless, the size of a person but wrong in shape, rising up from under the surface. Mark froze. Then it was gone. The thunder followed a breath later. He stumbled back, slipping in the mud, staring at the spot. What the hell was that? Rafi and Steve ran toward him, the rain soaking them through. The water was calm again, empty, but the current had changed direction, subtly, impossibly, flowing upstream. Steve took a step back. "Let's go." No one argued. "Hello." They piled back into the van, dripping and silent. Rafi didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on the windshield, where rain traced thin, trembling lines down the glass. The creek was just visible beyond the trees, still moving the wrong way, like something beneath it was breathing in. He whispered, barely audible over the storm. Nothing could hold its breath that long. Amberville, Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. Scene 2, Nothing could hold its breath that long. The rain came back the way a wound reopens. At first, just a few drops, soft, scattered, tapping the leaves above. Then a shift in the wind, and the sky cracked open like a fault line. Water poured down in sheets, hammering the tents, flattening the grass, drowning the sound of everything else. Mark ran for the fire pit, cursing. "All that work!" he yelled, kicking at the embers as they hissed out. "Forget the fire," Steve shouted over the downpour. "Get the gear." They scrambled, tossing sleeping bags and clothes into the van. Everything slick and heavy. The ground had turned to mud again, sucking at their boots. Raffi slipped once, catching himself on the bumper. His palms were streaked brown with wet ash. He wiped them on his jeans, but it only smeared. The rain didn't let up. It felt angry. Hello. By the time they piled into the van, the storm had swallowed the forest whole. Wind bent the trees in long arcs, and lightning flashed behind. The clouds, just a flicker of white through the endless gray. Mark twisted the key. The engine coughed. Then, nothing. He tried again. Come on. The van clicked uselessly. Seriously? Steve muttered. Now? Mark slammed the steering wheel. It was fine yesterday. Jerry hugged her knees in the back seat. We'll wait it out, she said. Softly. Storms don't last forever. Thunder answered her, a long, rolling growl that rattled the doors. Raffi stared out the fogged window. Through the rain, the trees looked closer than they had before, pressing in around the clearing. The water pooled at their bases, rippling in strange patterns, almost like movement. Hello! An hour passed. The rain softened but never stopped. They were quiet now, the tension settling like weight on their shoulders. Mark drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Steve chewed the inside of his cheek, and Jerry just stared out her window, camera clutched to her chest. Then, something moved. It wasn't lightning this time, not wind. Just for a second, Raffi thought he saw a shape between the trees. Tall, narrow, moving against the rain. It vanished as soon as the next flash hit. He blinked hard, rubbed the fog off the glass. Nothing there. But when the thunder rolled again, the sound seemed to carry a half-second too long, like an echo, deep and hollow, from somewhere beneath the earth. Hello. I think it's letting up, Mark said, though it wasn't. He opened the door anyway, stepping out into the mist. Mark, Raffi started, but he was already gone, squinting through the downpour toward the creek. The water had risen nearly to the edge now, rushing fast and black. Trees leaned over it like watchers. Mark called back, "Hey, look at this!" Lightning flashed, and Raffi saw him clearly for just a heartbeat. Standing knee-deep near the bank, his reflection shimmering in the current. Then something moved below that reflection. It wasn't clear, just pale, almost colorless, the size of a person but wrong in shape, rising up from under the surface. Mark froze. Then it was gone. The thunder followed a breath later. He stumbled back, slipping in the mud, staring at the spot. What the hell was that? Raffi and Steve ran toward him, the rain soaking them through. The water was calm again, empty, but the current had changed direction, subtly, impossibly, flowing upstream. Steve took a step back. Let's go. No one argued. Hi. They piled back into the van, dripping and silent. Raffi didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on the windshield, where rain traced thin, trembling lines down the glass. The creek was just visible beyond the trees, still moving the wrong way, like something beneath it was breathing in. He whispered, barely audible over the storm. Nothing could hold its breath that long. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 2, continued. Nothing could hold its breath that long. The echo came again, soft, almost playful this time. This isn't real. The words weren't quite his anymore. They carried a damp, unfamiliar rhythm, as though mouthed through water. Raffi turned toward the window, expecting the reflection of his own pale face, but the glass only showed movement, slow, deliberate, like the tide, withdrawing across stones. The wind had gone still. Even the branches outside seemed to have forgotten how to move. He waited for the next thunderclap, but it didn't come. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant, like an animal crouched before a leap. Raffia's throat felt dry. "Mark?" he called, barely above a breath. No answer. The others slept like bodies that had been arranged, too deep. Daphne's arm lay flung across the edge of her sleeping bag, her fingers twitching faintly as though she were feeling for something that wasn't there. He rose slowly. The floor creaked once beneath his heel and seemed to travel through the cabin's ribs. For a moment, Raffi thought he could hear the sound echo back, not through the air, but from below. He crouched and pressed his palm against the floorboards. They were cold, damp, the rhythmic thudding he'd heard earlier, like something breathing through the earth, had returned, steadier now. It seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, then deliberately fall out of. Sink. He couldn't tell if it was coming from beneath the cabin or inside him. When he stood again, his shadow lagged half a second behind him on the wall, just long enough for his stomach to twist. Something whispered near his ear, not words this time, but a shape. A voice that hadn't yet learned how to form sentences. Raffi stumbled back and hit the wall. His breath came short. He looked toward the window again, desperate for the storm, the noise, anything. But outside, the rain had stopped completely. The world beyond the glass was a pale, colorless sheet. No trees, no sky, just a depthless fog that trembled when he moved, as if watching him. He whispered, "Please," but the fog answered first. It didn't speak exactly, it breathed. And then, for a fraction of a second, Raffi saw the outline of a face. Pressing through it, his own. Amberville. Chapter 4, Scene 2, continued. Nothing could hold its breath that long. The face didn't move, but the fog around it rippled like breath against glass. Then it blanked. Raffi stumbled backward so hard he struck the edge of the bunk. Noise finally stirred someone. Steve shifted in his sleep, muttering something incoherent, but didn't wake. The others lay still. Their breathing had synchronized, a single soft rhythm filling the cabin, rising and falling in perfect time. The face outside tilted slightly, as if listening to that sound. Raffi pressed a hand to the glass, cold, wet. The outline mimicked him palm to palm, skin to condensation. But where his fingers met theirs, mirror, they didn't align. The other hand had too many joints. He tore his hand away, stumbling toward the center of the room. "Wake! Up!" he whispered, then louder, "Wake up!" No one moved. He crouched beside Daphne and shook her shoulder. Her skin was cold, clammy. When he lifted his hand, the impression of his fingers remained,
pressed deep into her arm like marks in clay.
Something shifted beneath the floor, a dull, dragging scrape. Raffi froze. The sound came again, long, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled through the soil under the cabin. Then a knock. Once, twice, slow and even from beneath his feet. He stared at the boards. The sound was close now, traveling toward him. And when it stopped, he could feel a faint breath of air seeping up. Between the cracks,
It smelled like rain and rot.
And faintly familiar. A voice, muffled by wood, whispered, "Whisper." "Raffi, it's all right now." He fell back, heart hammering. The voice was gentle, his mother's voice. But she'd been dead for 3 years. The boards beneath him pulsed once, as if something large had exhaled. Then the voice spoke again, softer now, impossibly close to his ear. "You just have to stop pretending you're awake." Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 4, Scene 2, continued. Nothing could hold its breath that long. Raffi stayed very still, listening. The voice had gone. The only sound now was the other's breathing, slow, even almost rehearsed. The storm had passed, leaving a thin mist that pressed against the windows like skin. He told himself it was nothing, old wood and nerves, the sound of rain, settling in the earth. He repeated it over and over in his mind until the words felt like a lullaby. "This isn't real. It's just an old cabin." The phrase steadied him. He said it again, quieter. "It's just an old cabin, that's all." The fog outside trembled once, as though something unseen had exhaled. Then it stilled. Raffi drew his knees up under the sleeping bag, listening for any sound. Beneath the floor, nothing now but his pulse. The silence had a weight to it, like a ceiling pressing down. He turned his head toward Daphne. Her face looked peaceful again, pale. In the faint light, her breathing steady. The marks on her arm were gone. Or maybe they'd never been there. Tomorrow, they'd be moving closer to the lake. Mark had insisted, said the path east would be shorter, that they'd make better time near the shoreline. Raffi almost laughed. After tonight, the last thing he wanted was water. But he didn't argue. It was easier to agree, easier to believe that things would make sense again in the daylight. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about how the boards above him and the soil below seemed to share the same slow rhythm. Just one more night, he told himself. Then the lake. Then answers. The fog outside thickened once more, drifting against the window like a hand that didn't quite know how to knock. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 3. The day that didn't arrive. Morning never came. Something like daylight seeped through the fog, but it had no warmth. It was the color of bone and cold water, the kind of light that seemed to come from the ground instead of the sky. The trees glistened with dew that never fell, and the cabin behind them steamed faintly in the wet. Mark was the first to laugh. It startled Raffi, not because it was wrong, but because it sounded so natural. Well, Mark said, stamping his boots into the mud, guess we made
Through
it.
the night. Told you the roof wouldn't cave in.
Daphne grinned as she tightened her pack. You didn't tell anyone, Mark. You argued it loudly. Steve added, and you were wrong about the leak, by the way. He gestured to his damp sleeve. See? Evidence. Even Jerry laughed, wiping her hands on her jacket. At least it wasn't lightning this time. I'll take leaks over electrocution. Their voices carried softly through the mist, buoyant, bright. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, as if the forest didn't quite know what to do with such a living noise.
Raffi tried to smile, but his jaw felt tight. The laughter washed around
him, easy and warm, and somehow it made the air colder. The world had not changed much since the night before. Everything was still wet, still gray, still faintly trembling. Yet everyone seemed lighter. Mark kept cracking jokes about breakfast, about the idea of breakfast, since none of them had eaten more than dry granola. Steve sang tunelessly under his breath. Even Daphne seemed brighter, her clearer
eyes
than they had been in days. Raffi followed quietly. The path was soft with mud, the kind that swallowed their boots halfway. To the ankle, each step made a wet, satisfied sound. But no one complained. They laughed about the way the earth tried to eat them, about the way the fog gave them cinematic lighting. Feels like a movie, Daphne said, lifting her face to the pale air. You know, like one of those misty travel scenes before the big reveal. Raffi wanted to tell her that it didn't feel like a movie. It felt like being underwater, like the whole forest was holding its breath. But he said nothing. Mark led the group with easy confidence, cutting through the fog with his stride. Lake's not far now, he said. If we're lucky, we'll get a bit of sun by the time we reach it. The others cheered softly at the word sun, as if it were a promise. Raffi lagged behind, watching the footprints they left behind them. The mud filled them in too quickly, swallowing the shapes before they could dry. Each mark vanished almost instantly, erased as if they'd there. He tried to convince himself that it didn't mean anything, that it was just the wet ground, just the weather, but his chest felt heavy. The fog curled between the trees, slow and deliberate. Once or twice he thought he saw something moving ahead of them, something that darted
away before his eyes could focus.
But every time he looked up, he saw only his friends, laughing, slipping in the mud, helping one another up, oblivious to the way the woods leaned closer around them. They looked alive.
They sounded alive.
And Raffia, trailing behind, feeling the cold crawl into his sleeves, wasn't sure if he still did. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 3. The Day That Didn't Arrive. Morning. Light seeped in slowly, but it wasn't sunlight, just a colorless brightness that made everything in the cabin look damp and unsteady. The air smelled of wet bark and cold iron. Raffi sat up in his sleeping bag, unsure when he'd actually fallen. Asleep. His body ached as though he'd been awake the whole night, but his mind felt bruised and soft, like something had been pressing on it. For hours. Mark was already up, hunched near the window. His breath fogged the glass in short, impatient bursts. "Storm's gone," he said. "We should move out soon. We'll make the lake by noon if we keep a good pace." Raffi looked past him. The fog hadn't lifted, it had just thinned enough to see the trees bending inward, their branches webbed with moisture. The ground was slick and uneven. Everything dripped, but there was no sound of rainfall. Daphne stirred. "It feels later than morning." Steve was pulling on his boots. "It's morning, just a bad one." But the light outside didn't change. It stayed that same dull gray. Neither dawn nor day. The forest looked waterlogged, as though it hadn't taken a real breath in years. Rafia's hand brushed the floorboard where the voice had whispered to him. It was dry now, cold, nothing unusual, but still he pulled his hand back quickly. Mark shouldered his pack. "Come on, we'll follow the stream east till the lake. It's maybe 3 miles." Rafi almost asked if anyone else had dreamed, but no one met his eyes. They moved quietly, folding their things, careful not to speak too loud, as if the air itself might be listening. When they stepped outside, the world felt muffled. The mist clung to their clothes and skin. The path, half swallowed by roots, led east. Somewhere behind them, deep under the cabin, something shifted once. Slow and deliberate, like settling earth. And the fog, if you watched it long enough, seemed to follow. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 4, continued. The lake. By late afternoon, the air had turned golden and mild. The fog never returned. Even the chill that had haunted the woods seemed to have burned away, leaving only the steady sound of small waves curling against the shore. Someone, probably Steve, had managed to smuggle a few beers in his pack. And Mark, triumphant, revealed a bundle of hot dogs wrapped in foil. "See?" he said, brandishing them like treasure. "I told you I planned." Ahead, the group cheered. Daphne found a few dry sticks near the tree line and built a small fire in a ring of stones, her hands deft and steady. Jerry struck a match, and within minutes the flames were breathing orange. Into the fading light, the smoke wound upward into the open air, carrying the scent of pine and salt. They ate slowly, laughing between bites, their voices bright against the sound of the water. The world felt wide again. The woods seemed harmless. From here, distant, green, almost gentle. Mark passed a can of beer to Rafi. "You sure you don't want one?" Rafi hesitated. Then he took it. "Why not?" he said, and cracked it open. The hiss of carbonation felt startlingly alive. The first sip was bitter and cold, grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He leaned back on his elbows, watching the others argue over whose hot dog had fallen into the fire first. Daphne was doubled over laughing, Steve protesting loudly, Jerry waving her stick like a referee. For the first time in a long while, Raffi laughed too. A real unforced, unguarded. The tension in his shoulders loosened. The colors of the lake deepened. As the sun dipped lower, turning the surface copper and violet, a breeze drifted across the water, soft enough to raise goosebumps, but not enough to make him shiver. He smiled, without
It
meaning
felt
to.
strange at first, like testing a forgotten muscle. Then easier. Lighter. He thought for a fleeting moment that maybe the worst was over. Maybe the night had only been fear and exhaustion playing tricks. Maybe the woods weren't haunted at all, just misunderstood, like everything
Amberville.
The laughter around the fire grew louder, full and alive. Steve sang a fragment of an old song. Daphne joined in, off-key but joyful. Mark poked at the fire, sending up sparks that drifted into the dusk. Raffi took another sip of beer and stared out across the lake. The water caught the last of the light, perfectly still, perfectly calm. He felt good, really good. And though he didn't notice it at first, the reflection in the water too, just a heartbeat after he did. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 4, continued. The lake. The fire had burned down to a slow, patient glow. Embers cracked softly, sending up thin ribbons of smoke that twisted into the night. The breeze off the lake had cooled. It moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine. Mark yawned and pushed himself to his feet. "That's it for me," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tomorrow we make the ridge, right?" "Yeah," Steve said, standing to. "If we're lucky, we'll find
Ground
some dry
to camp on before dark.
Daphne gave a sleepy laugh. "Dry ground sounds like a myth." "Everything's a myth here," Jerry said, half joking, but her voice had already softened with fatigue. They lingered a while longer, unwilling to move, caught in the quiet rhythm of the fire and the soft pulse of the lake against the shore. Was easy to pretend that this small circle of warmth, the smell of smoke and cooked food, the comfortable murmur of friends, was what they'd been chasing all along. But eventually, one by one, they rose. Mark stretched and slapped Steve's shoulder. Steve and Daphne shared a tired laugh. Jerry leaned in to bump her fist gently against Raphius. "Don't stay up too late," she said. "I won't." A few hand slaps, a few goodnight murmurs, then the shuffle of feet and the faint rasp of zippers. The camp quieted, folding itself into stillness. The laughter lingered for a moment, like a song that refuses to end, before it, too, dissolved into the hum of crickets and water. Raffi stayed where he was. The night had thickened around the camp, warm at first, then closer. Closer still. It seemed to pour in from the trees, from the dark between spaces, the tents, until it pressed softly against the firelight. It didn't feel like menace. It felt like being held. The dark wrapped itself around the campsite like a mother's hug, gentle, but inescapable, firm enough to quiet everything inside it. The air grew still. The sound of the lake softened to a breath. Raffi stirred the coals absently, watching the sparks rise and vanish. He felt the quiet in his bones, a stillness so complete that it almost hurt. The others were asleep now. Their silhouettes shifted faintly inside, small and safe. He smiled faintly. For the first time in days, the fear had gone. The world was soft again, forgiving. He leaned back on his hands and looked out across the lake. The water was so still it seemed solid, reflecting the dim stars and the last glow of the fire behind him. The night pressed a little closer, tender and dark. And though Raffi didn't notice, the reflection on the lake tilted its head a few seconds after he did, as if listening for the same
Amberville,
quiet.
Chapter 4, Scene 4.
The lake. By the time they reached the lake, the fog had vanished as though it had. The
Never
air
been
was
there.
cool, clean, and weightless. The forest opened suddenly into a broad clearing, and before them stretched the water, so still and clear. It seemed to hold the sky inside it. The surface shimmered, catching the light like a living thing, every ripple a small miracle. Mark whooped and dropped his pack first. Finally, civilization! He tossed a pebble into the shallows, grinning when the
Spread
ripples
out in perfect circles.
Daphne laughed, pulling off her jacket and tipping
Breathe.
her face to the... "It's beautiful," she said simply, and her voice carried easily. Across the open
Steve
air,
was
was already kneeling at the edge, running his fingers through the water. "You can see the bottom," he said. "I mean, all the way down." Jerry joined him, crouching beside the rocks. "It's so clear, it doesn't look
Raffi
real."
stood
a few feet back, his pack still slung over his shoulder. Light was softer here, gold threaded through the gray sky. The air smelled like pine and cold stone. For the first time in what felt like days, there was no sound beneath the surface. No whisper, no echo, no slow breathing earth. The others moved easily, laughing, skipping stones,
Sore
stretching
limbs.
their voices rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of the waves. Even their laughter sounded clean, unburdened. It should have been perfect. Raffi tried to join in. He even smiled when Mark splashed Steve. Nearly lost his footing. But something about the stillness of the lake made his skin prickle. The reflections on the surface didn't quite
Their
match.
movements.
They lagged, faintly delayed, as if the water needed a moment to remember who was who. He looked down at his own reflection and saw himself smiling back. It looked right until it blinked before he did. He tore his gaze away and stared across the lake instead. On the far side, the trees grew close together, their shapes distorted
of
by
light
the on water. For a moment, Raffi thought he saw something move between them, just a shadow, slipping deeper into the woods. "Hey!" Mark called. "You okay back there?" Raffi blinked, forcing a grin. "Yeah, just taking it in." Mark nodded, satisfied. Good day for it. It was. The weather was perfect. Not too warm, not too cold. A light breeze moved across the water, making the surface dance. Everything was vivid, precise, almost luminous. It was an amazing day. It was too amazing. And as Raffi watched the others laugh and stretch out on the shore,
Realized
he couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching them. Amberville,
2,
Chapter 4, Scene 5. The deepening night. The fire was nearly gone. Only a few glowing threads of ember clung to the blackened wood, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of something. Small and patient, the lake had gone utterly still again, with
Glassed
moonlight
over.
so pale it looked like ice. Raffi pulled his jacket tighter. The air had turned sharp, filled with that dry, cold smell that comes before dawn, but he knew it wasn't close to morning yet. The stars hadn't moved. The moon seemed caught in place, hovering just above the trees as though waiting for something. He told himself it was just the beer, just exhaustion. But the quiet pressed harder now. Every sound he made, the soft crunch of his sleeve, the shift of his boots felt too loud, as though the whole forest were holding its breath to listen. He looked toward the tents. Everyone was asleep, their outlines faint in the orange half-light. Steve's arm flung over his face, Daphne's hair spilling over the pillow. Jerry curled tight, peaceful. For the first time since arriving, Raffi didn't envy them their sleep. It felt wrong to close his eyes out here, wrong to let the lake out of He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and watched the water. It shimmered faintly when he breathed, like a thin layer of glass with each exhale. He tried to find his reflection again, but the surface was too dark. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it, his own outline, staring back from the black. Only it wasn't quite right. The face in the water seemed a little closer, the shadows beneath too deep, the mouth too calm. He blinked. The image didn't. Raffi's hand tightened around the stick he'd been using to stir the fire. He leaned closer to the water, the soft mud yielding under his feet. Knees. The reflection leaned closer too, perfectly timed, perfectly mirrored until he stopped breathing. Then it didn't stop. It kept moving. A ripple shivered across the lake, small but steady. The water sighed against the rocks, and Raffi pulled back, heart quickening. For a moment, he thought he saw something move below the surface, an arm, maybe, or the shape of a shoulder turning slowly in the depths. He told himself it was a trick of the moonlight. The wind shifted, cool and damp, brushing his cheek. It smelled faintly sweet, like rainwater caught in stone. The surface stilled again, so calm, that when he looked down, the reflection was smiling once more. "Not funny," Raffi whispered, his voice almost gone. The reflection didn't change. He sat back and stared across the lake. The trees on the opposite shore were pitch black now, their shapes dissolved into a single wavering line. Somewhere out there, something gave a long, low creak, like wood, bending underwater. The fire let out a final sigh and folded in on itself, leaving Raffi alone with the dark. The night didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of breath, of watching, of waiting. And when Raffi finally lay back on the damp earth, eyes fixed on the still water, he thought he could hear his own voice somewhere beneath. The surface, whispering softly for him to come closer. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 5, The Deepening Night. Raffi sat near the fire until it was little more than smoldering coals. Each breath of wind bringing a faint orange flicker to life before it dimmed again. The heat reached him only in pulses now, like something remembering how to be warm. He sat cross-legged, elbows on his knees, eyes half-focused on the glow. The night was deep and heavy, pressing close, But for the first time in hours, his thoughts wandered inward. He thought about yesterday. The walk through the woods, the way they'd all joked about the mud, how Daphne had slipped and laughed until her cheeks turned red. Steve teasing her, Mark playing guide, Jerry humming a song no one else knew. The sound of their laughter felt real when he reached for it, as though it might still be echoing somewhere out among the trees. The word landed like a stone in his mind. Yesterday had been full of small things, warm things. The rhythm of footsteps in wet leaves, the glint of light through fog, the way they'd talked about what they'd do after the trip when they went home. Home. The idea felt thin now, transparent. He couldn't picture the street, or the sound of cars, or even the smell of the air there. When he tried to remember, the image folded in on itself, like paper burning too fast to read. He looked toward the lake. The surface was still, perfectly calm. Moon's reflection pulsing faintly on the water. It looked so gentle from here, peaceful. He wanted to believe it. But beneath the peace, beneath the silence, Raffi felt something shift. Not a sound, not a movement, just a quiet awareness, the way a room feels when someone else is in it. He looked back to the fire. The coals were nearly dark now, a low red. Smolder surrounded by ash. He reached forward with a stick and stirred them once, watching a small burst of sparks swirl upward, fade, and vanish. Yesterday, he said aloud. The word came out soft, uncertain. The lake seemed to breathe in response, a long, patient inhale that stirred the surface but didn't make a sound. Raffi closed his eyes. The warmth of the fire was gone. The air smelled like rain and stone. He wondered if morning would come this time. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 6. Hangovers. Morning, or what passed for it, came slow and gray. The sky was the color of tin, flat and dull, and the air hung heavy with the smell of cold water and ash. The fire pit was nothing but a ring of white dust now, faintly steaming where a few stubborn coals clung to. Life. Raffi woke first, his head thick and heavy, mouth dry with the sour and smoke. His neck ached from where he'd fallen asleep. Sitting up, chin to chest, the sound that woke him wasn't bird song or wind, but the faint, rhythmic lapping of the lake against the shore. It sounded almost deliberate. He sat there for a while, blanking against the pale light, trying to remember when he'd fallen asleep. His thoughts came slow, scattered, like pieces of paper drifting apart in a breeze. One by one, the others stirred. Mark was the loudest, groaning as he rolled out of his tent. God, he muttered, clutching his head. Who let me drink that second beer? Third, Steve said from somewhere inside his sleeping bag. And no one stopped you. Jerry laughed softly, still wrapped in her blanket. We're all adults. Here, poor stupid adults. Daphne emerged last, her hair tangled, her voice low. Coffee would solve everything, she said. Then, realizing there was none, they moved slowly, half smiles, half winces. The air between them was easy, comfortable, until until Mark looked toward the lake. "Damn," he said, squinting. "Would you look at that?" The others followed his gaze. The lake was glass again, utterly smooth, without so much as a ripple. Stretched under the gray sky like a mirror, reflecting everything too. Clearly too still. Even their movements seemed hesitant beside it, as if sound and motion didn't belong here anymore. "Huh. Creepy kind of pretty." Daphne crouched by the waterline, tracing a finger through the cold. "Shallows. It's freezing," she said, smiling faintly. "You'd think it would move more in this wind." "There isn't any wind," Rafi said before he realized he'd spoken. The others glanced at him. He rubbed his temples and looked away. "Sorry, headache." Mark grinned. "Yeah, well, hangovers are proof of life. You're fine." But Rafi wasn't sure. The lake didn't look fine. It didn't look alive either. It looked like it was waiting. The others went about their morning routine, stretching, packing, complaining softly. Someone joked about needing aspirin, someone else about quitting drinking forever. Laughter came easily again, bright but brittle. Rafi stayed near the edge of the water, watching. The reflection looked back at him, perfect, motionless. Then, as the others turned away, something small broke the surface. Just a ripple, a circle spreading outward, and was gone before he could tell where it began. He blinked hard, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. The water smoothed itself back into silence.
Behind him,
Unbothered,
Mark called
patient.
out, "You coming, man?"
Rafi hesitated, then tore his gaze away. "Yeah," he said, voice faint. "Yeah, I'm coming." But when he turned his back on the lake, he thought he heard it. Breathe, long and low, like the exhale of something that had just woken up. Amberville, Chapter 4, Scene 7. The thud beneath. By late morning, the world felt almost new again. The gray of dawn had lifted, replaced by a soft light that turned the lake to silver blue. Glass. A breeze moved across the water, gentle but cool, carrying the scent of pine and stone. The fog was gone. Everything seemed clean. Washed, alive. Mark stood at the water's edge, barefoot, grinning. "All right," he said. "Who's brave enough?" Daphne groaned, shading her eyes. "You're kidding. It's probably freezing." "That's the point," Mark said, already pulling off his shirt. "Shock the system. Burn out the hangover. Instant rebirth." "Instant hypothermia," Steve muttered, but he was smiling. Jerry tossed a pebble into the shallows. It plunked and vanished. "You first," she said. Mark laughed and waded in without hesitation, splashing water at them as he went. "Come on, it's not that bad." Within minutes, the air was full of their shouts and laughter. Steve followed, cursing at the cold. Daphne let out a small shriek as she stepped in, then burst into giggles. Jerry took her time, moving carefully until the water reached her waist. Rafi was the last to follow, the chill cutting through him sharply before dulling into something strangely comforting. They swam in the shallows, throwing handfuls of water. Another to daring go deeper. One. The lake held them easily, cool, silent, endless. For a while, it felt like any summer morning, the smell of sun on skin. the sound of voices echoing over open water.
Mark dove under and surfaced again.
Forehead.
Slick hair plastered
It's
to his...
incredible, he shouted. It's so clear, you can see.
Everything. Steve blinked water from his eyes. Everything? Yeah, look. Mark pointed down into the depths. There's movement. A shimmer darted below them, quick as lightning. Fish! Daphne gasped. Did you see it?
Jerry frowned. What fish? There's nothing supposed to live up here.
It's too cold.
Another flash, this one nearer to the surface, silver, smooth, gone.
Before they could follow it.
Mark grinned. Guess someone forgot to tell the fish. But Raffi wasn't smiling. He'd seen something in that flash. Something.
Not quite right. Too long, maybe. Too pale. The light caught it wrong.
Looks big, Steve said, half laughing, half apprehensive. Don't let it. Nibble your toes. They all laughed again, but the sound felt thinner now. The echoes, strange against the still air.
Then came the smell. At first, it was faint, a salty sweetness, clean but wrong. Then, stronger. Seaweed, damp rock, the scent of the ocean where no ocean could be. Daphne wrinkled her nose. Do you smell that?
Jerry nodded. Yeah, it's
Mark
like
splashed her.
salt water. You two city people think everything natural smells.
No,
Weird,
she said, voice quieter now. It's wrong. Lakes don't smell like that. Before anyone could respond, it happened. A deep, heavy thud. Not loud, not sharp, just low, resonant, like something enormous shifting. Beneath them, it was felt more than heard. The water quivered, a tremor, moving through it like a breath through
went
lungs.
still.
What the hell was that? Steve said. Daphne gave a short, nervous laugh. Probably rocks or a wave? There are no waves, Jerry whispered. They stood waist deep in the water, staring at the ripples that spread. Outward, slow, and deliberate. It felt as if the entire lake had just moved
Rafia's
an inch
heart was
closer
beating
to them.
too fast. Did you feel that?
Mark forced a grin. Probably a mudslide, or a fish, big one. But no one laughed this time. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Then, almost on cue, Steve flicked water at Daphne. All right, Spooky. Moment over, he said. Back to swimming before I freeze to death. The laughter returned, thin at first, then fuller. Daphne shoved him. Jerry splashed them both. Mark dove under again, chasing something imaginary. The sound of their joy filled the air once more, but Raffi couldn't bring himself to join. He stayed still, water up to his chest, eyes fixed on the lake's surface. The ripples were gone, the smell had faded, and everything was calm again.
He told himself
to let it go. Just sound, just water. But when he dove under, holding his breath, the water was cold and silent and bottomless. There was nothing. No fish, no rocks, no light. Only darkness stretching downward forever. When he surfaced, the others were laughing on the shore, rapping.
themselves in towels, steam rising from their skin. Mark shouted, "You!" "Coming in or what?" Raffi nodded and started back. But as he climbed onto the rocks, he felt
a faint vibration beneath his feet, like a drumbeat too far. He looked back at the water. It was perfect again, still and shining, reflecting them all like a photograph. And for just a second, he thought he saw the reflection of one more, a figure standing among them, taller, then
distant,
the breeze picked
watching.
up, and the surface rippled, and it was gone. Amberville, Chapter 4,
What yesterday
Scene
left
9.
behind. Morning again, if that's what this was. The light had changed. It wasn't gold or gray now, but something in between, a weak, colorless glow that made the air look thick. The trees seemed taller, their trunks leaning at new angles. Even the birds sounded wrong, farther away, faint and uncertain. Raffi woke to the sound of rustling. Daphne was making coffee, or trying to, though the flame kept guttering out. Mark stood by the lake, rubbing his temples, staring across the surface as if he'd forgotten why he was there. Steve muttered, "Didn't we pack more wood?" Jerry looked up from where she sat near the ashes. "We used it all last night." "No," he said, frowning. "No, we didn't." Raffi sat up. The others were scattered around the
Different
camp like
days.
pieces from their voices sounded normal, but the rhythm of them felt wrong, too slow, too spaced apart. "Hey," Daphne said to no one in particular.
"Sunday?
What day
Mark
is
said
it?" automatically. "No," Steve replied. "It was Sunday yesterday." That word again. It fell into the silence like a stone. Raffi rubbed his eyes. "Yesterday," he repeated under his breath. But the memory didn't come the way it should have. He could recall the shape of it, the fire, the swimming, the smell of the air, but not the sequence. Everything bled together like a photograph left in rain. When he looked toward the lake, the reflection of the sky was dull and milky, rippled not by wind, but by slow, even circles, one after another, as though the surface were breathing again. Mark stepped closer to the water's edge. "Anyone else see that?" Jerry nodded slowly. "It hasn't stopped since dawn." They watched for a while. The ripples came from nowhere,
Outward and
spreading again and again. It was hypnotic, almost soothing. Until Raffi realized something. The circles weren't overlapping. He
were
stood
forming a
without meaning
pattern.
to. The others followed his gaze. The ripples had begun arranging themselves into perfect rings, each larger than the last, spaced evenly across the lake. Mark whispered, "It's counting." No one laughed. The fire crackled weakly behind them. The air smelled of wet wood and salt. Raffi took a step back, the mud soft beneath his boots. His voice was quiet when he said it. So quiet it almost wasn't there. Yesterday didn't end. And somehow they all believed him. Amberville, Chapter 5, continued. Calm. The night settled in gently, almost kindly. The fire had burned itself down to a low, steady pulse
that matched
a
the
slow
soft
rhythm rise and fall of sleeping breath around it. Above, The stars shone sharp and close, nearer than they should have been, as if the sky had bent down to listen. The lake lay still and silver, smooth as glass. Every now and then a faint ring rippled outward, so slow it could have been imagined.
But
The
forgiving.
air
The world, for the first time in too long,
Rafi
seemed
sat
content to
beside the
rest.
coals, knees drawn to his chest, staring into the red glow. It was the kind of calm that made you forget what came before. The laughter, the music, the strange delay in their reflections, all of it softened, dissolved, as though
told
the
himself
night had
that was
erased
good,
it, that they needed this. Behind him, the others slept. Daphne, arm resting on the ground. Mark snoring faintly. Steve and Jerry quiet, except for the occasional twitch or sigh. Their faces looked peaceful, younger somehow. The sound of them breathing filled the clearing, slow and even. For a while, Rafi let it lull him. He looked up. The stars reflected perfectly in the water, so perfectly that he couldn't tell which was sky and which was lake. His eyes adjusted, and for a dizzying instant, it felt as though he were sitting upside down, staring up into the depths instead of down into the reflection. The thought made him smile. A tired, dazed kind of smile. "It's calm now," he whispered, and the sound of his voice felt small, almost unnecessary. The wind had stopped hours ago. The forest was utterly still. No rustle, no creak, not even the sigh of leaves turning in their sleep. The world had gone quiet in a way that wasn't silence, but expectation. He could feel it pressing lightly at the edges of his mind, like something waiting for him to speak again. He thought of home, though it was getting harder to remember what that looked like. The smell of wet concrete after rain, the sound of his neighbor's radio on Sunday mornings, the streetlight that flickered outside his window. They were there in his mind, but blurred, like scenes from a dream retold too many times. The fire cracked once, startling him. A small ember leapt free and landed in the dirt, pulsing faintly before fading. He watched it die and thought about how everything seemed to do that now: burn, fade, return. He lay back slowly, hands folded behind his head. The earth was cool, damp beneath the sleeping bag. He could feel it, the faint pulse under the ground, rhythmic and slow, like a heart far too large to belong to anything he could name. His eyes drifted to the lake again. The reflection hadn't changed, but it looked wrong now, too exact, too obedient. It shimmered when he blinked, like a living photograph trying to hold still. He told himself not to look for meaning, not tonight, just calm. He thought of the others, their laughter, their clumsy dancing, their relief when the day had finally gone right. It almost made him laugh again, the way everything could be terrible and beautiful at the same time. Then something occurred to him, a small, absurd thought that made his chest tighten. He couldn't remember how the song had ended. The one they danced to. He tried to recall the last note, the final word, but his mind stopped short every time. The memory was there, but sealed off, like a room with the door locked from the inside. He sat up again, pulse quickening. The air felt heavier. The stars didn't seem to move. He watched the lake, waiting for another ripple, any sign of life. But there was nothing. Perfect stillness.
perfect calm. The kind that doesn't soothe, the kind that listens. He lay down again, forcing his eyes shut. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we go home." It was almost enough to make him believe it. Almost. The earth thrummed beneath him, a long, patient vibration, deep and old, matching the rhythm of his slowing heartbeat. And just before sleep took him, Raffi thought he heard something whisper back, far below the surface. Home. Amberville, Chapter 5, continued. The last good day. By late afternoon, everything felt almost normal again. The air had warmed, the gray had lifted, and the woods were full of small, good sounds. The flutter of birds, the soft hum of water against stone, the rhythm of boots moving through shallow mud. It felt, for once, like a real day. "Tomorrow we head home," Mark said. He said it casually, but there was a kind of hope in it, like saying it might make it true. "Ah, finally," Steve groaned, stretching his arms overhead. "My back's gonna need a month to forgive me." Daphne laughed. "You'll miss it once we're back. Admit it." Not a chance. They set up camp for what they all swore would be the last night. The tents went up quickly. The smell of smoke returned, warm, familiar, unthreatening. For a while, it felt like the tension of the last few days had simply washed away with the light. Someone found the speaker, half battery, cracked, and Mark got it working just enough to play a few broken songs. They danced clumsily around the fire, feet crunching against the dirt, laughing too loud. Daphne spun with her hands up, the hem of her shirt catching the glow. Jerry hummed along, low and tuneless but happy. Steve drummed on an empty can with a stick. Mark sang the wrong words on purpose, shouting them like a challenge. Even Raffi smiled. He didn't dance, but he watched. The way the flames reflected in their eyes, how their laughter carried across the lake and came back a moment later, echoing just enough to sound like someone else was laughing too. For a heartbeat, it was perfect. A wonderful ending to a great day. Tomorrow they would go home. That was the promise. And everyone believed it because believing was easier than thinking. They sang louder. They shouted to the trees, to the water, to each other. Kids again, for just a little while. The sky turned deep blue, and the first stars appeared. The reflection on the lake shimmered gently. The trees, the tents, the fire, and their moving bodies all flickering together like a single image caught between two worlds. When the song ended, no one spoke. They were breathing hard, flushed, grinning, alive. Then, the silence pressed in again. The lake was utterly still. Their reflections had stopped moving before they had. Raffi saw it first, the faint delay, like the surface was remembering the dance after it ended. He opened his mouth to speak, but didn't. The others were happy, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to ruin it. He looked at the fire instead, and for a moment, it looked like it was burning underwater. Amberville, Chapter 5, continued. Tomorrow was yesterday. "Why?" Raffi whispered. His voice barely reached the air. The others were still moving about the camp, half asleep, half repeating motions they'd already done. Folding blankets, checking packs, stretching their arms, everything mechanical, familiar. The morning had a pattern, and they were following it without knowing.
He turned back to the lake. How? His reflection watched him say it, lips moving a heartbeat too late. The water was flat, but it wasn't still. It pulsed, almost invisibly, as if something beneath was breathing slow and deep. That lake, he thought, holds more answers than we've ever asked. Answers to questions we haven't even thought of yet. He crouched, the cold biting through his knees, and watched the faint shimmer of light ripple through the water. For a moment, he felt certain, absolutely certain, that if he reached out, if he broke that surface, he'd understand. But the understanding wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to it. Behind him, Daphne laughed. It was the same laugh as yesterday, exactly the same pitch and length. She hadn't meant to, he realized. It had just happened again. Jerry called out, "We should move before the weather turns." "Yeah, same as yesterday." Raffi froze. "What did you say?" Mark looked confused. "I said, what? Why?" "You said, same as yesterday." "So?" Mark rubbed his eyes, yawning. "It's just a saying." "No, it wasn't. Not here. Not anymore." Raffi stood and looked back toward the water. The reflection was gone. Only the trees, bending wrong. Only the faint, circular ripples that never touched the shore. He whispered again, "Why?" And this time, from somewhere beneath the surface, came the smallest sound, like a word trying to be born. Not heard exactly, felt. A vibration through the bones, through the soil, through the air itself. Almost a reply. Then, silence. The others were talking again, laughing faintly, unaware. But Raffi could feel it now, the connection, alive and cold, threading through the ground beneath their feet. The lake didn't just hold their reflections, it remembered them. Amberville, Chapter 5, continued. Tomorrow was yesterday. "Why?" Raffi whispered. His voice barely reached the air. The others were still moving about the camp, half asleep, half repeating motions they'd already done, folding blankets, checking packs, stretching their arms. Everything mechanical, familiar. The morning had a pattern, and they were following it without knowing. He turned back to the lake. How? His reflection watched him say it, lips moving a heartbeat too late. The water was flat, but it wasn't still. It pulsed, almost invisibly, as if something beneath was breathing slow and deep. That lake, he thought, holds more answers than we've ever asked. Answers to questions we haven't even thought of yet. He crouched, the cold biting through his knees, and watched the faint shimmer of light ripple through the water. For a moment, he felt certain, absolutely certain, that if he reached out, if he broke that surface, he'd understand. But the understanding wouldn't belong to him. It would belong to it. The air above the lake felt thick, full of a quiet vibration, the kind that settles behind the ears and never quite fades. Behind him, Daphne laughed. It was the same laugh as yesterday, exactly the same pitch and length. She hadn't meant to, he realized. It had just happened again. Jerry called out, "We should move before the weather turns." Mark, "Yeah, same as yesterday." Raffi froze. "What did you say?" Mark looked confused. "I said, what? Why?" "You said, same as yesterday." So? Mark rubbed his eyes, yawning. It's just a saying. No, it wasn't. Not here. Not anymore. Raffi stood and looked back toward the water. The reflection was gone. Only the trees, bending wrong. Only the faint, circular ripples that never touched the shore. He whispered again, "Why?" And this time, from somewhere beneath the surface, came the smallest sound, like a word trying to be born. Not heard, exactly. Felt. A vibration through the bones, through the soil, through the air itself. Almost a reply. Then, silence. The others were talking again, laughing faintly, unaware. But Raffi could feel it now, the connection, alive and cold, threading through the ground beneath their feet. The lake didn't just hold their reflections. It remembered them. He crouched again, leaning closer. The light bent strangely over the surface, bending him with it. For a moment, he saw himself, dozens of times, layered faintly over one another, as if every yesterday he'd ever lived was standing there beside him. The faces moved out of rhythm, one smiling, one blinking, one turning away. "Do you see this?" he whispered, voice trembling. But when he looked over his shoulder, no one was watching. Mark was joking with Steve about some stupid thing from college. Daphne was brushing her hair. Jerry stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the trees like she'd forgotten what she was looking for. And the air smelt faintly of salt again. Raffi closed his eyes. "Stop," he said softly. "Please stop." When he opened them, the water had stilled. But he couldn't shake the sense that something had only paused, waiting for him to ask another question. He took a deep breath. "What are you?" The sound came back, clearer this time, low and wet, like the syllable of a word half drowned. He staggered back. The sound wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from inside his head. He turned away, dizzy. The world tilted slightly, as though the horizon had shifted without warning. The light flickered, not bright or dark, but something in between, as if the day couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Mark called out, "You okay, man?" Raffi nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just dizzy." "You need water?" At that, Raffi's mouth went dry. He looked at the lake again, at that perfect reflection. He didn't want to drink anything ever again. The others went back to their business, comfortable in the illusion of routine. But Raffi couldn't look away. The reflection had smoothed itself perfectly, but now it held something new. A faint distortion just beneath the surface, a shape, a suggestion of movement. It looked like a face. Only not his this time. It blinked. Raffi stumbled backward, tripping over a half-buried rock, heart hammering in his throat. He blinked, and the face was gone. Only water, only stillness. Only the sound of their laughter looping again like a broken record. He could feel the words pressing at the back of his mind, heavy and weighting, like something the lake had left inside him. Tomorrow was yesterday. Amberville, Chapter 6, continued. Raffi shook his head. Raffi shook his head. The whisper had come from nowhere. Or from him, and for a moment he couldn't tell which frightened him more. The sound still lingered in his skull, low and wet, a word half-formed and unfinished. He pressed his palms against his ears, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't in the air. It was deeper than that. "No," he muttered. "No, that's not—" The sentence dissolved. He stared out at the lake, its surface perfect again, the gravestone standing like a sentinel in the mist. His reflection sat beside it now, motionless, but wrong somehow. The tilt of the head was off, the eyes too dark. Raffi shook his head harder, as if that might rattle the thought loose. "This isn't real," he whispered. The reflection moved. Not a trick of the water this time. It shifted after him, a heartbeat too slow, like a delayed recording of his life. The mirrored Raffi stared back, its mouth open slightly, as though waiting for something to crawl out. Raffi stumbled backward, boots sinking into the mud. His breath came shallow, uneven. He couldn't feel the cold anymore. He turned to run, to go anywhere, to find the others, to wake up. But the trees behind him had drawn closer again, their shapes tight and skeletal, closing ranks around the shore. The lake sighed. A low, soft exhale that rippled outward across its skin. Raffi froze. The sound wasn't threatening. It was almost sorrowful. Like something tired of being misunderstood. He looked back. The gravestone's reflection had changed. The name was still his, but the letters beneath it were different now. Not a date this time. A word. "Stay," he whispered. "I can't." The water stirred. The reflection smiled, and the air around him felt suddenly heavy, thick with the scent of wet stone and iron, the same as before, only stronger now. Raffi took a step back, then another. His mind screamed, "Move!" but his body didn't listen. The lake had a pull, not physical, not quite, something older, quieter. It wasn't dragging him under. It was inviting him. He shook his head again, fiercely, until his vision blurred. The whisper returned, softer this time, closer. Not from below, from behind him. "Raffi!" He turned. The camp was gone. Amberville. Chapter 6 continued. The gravestone and the lake. Raffi sat down. His legs gave out before he realized he was falling, the mud soft beneath him, damp seeping through his clothes. He didn't care. The air felt thin, almost metallic in his lungs, and his heart wouldn't slow down. Across the water, the stone waited, his name carved deep into it. He tried to think of something rational, something small enough to hold in his mind. The smell of smoke from last night's fire, the sound of Daphne's laugh, the way the stars had looked before sleep. But each thought broke apart before it could settle. The lake kept swallowing them. He rubbed his face with both hands. "This isn't real," he said, but the words came out dull, unconvincing. He'd said them before, hadn't he? Back when the forest had felt wrong, when the nights had stretched too long. And every time, something had heard him. Now, the lake seemed to be listening again. He watched its surface, smooth, endless, as the gravestone's reflection shimmered faintly, the letters bending and flexing beneath the water. His name distorted into something that looked almost like language,
but not quite human. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. The sight pinned him. He thought of the others back at camp, or what he hoped was still camp. The trees had shifted. The air felt older. Maybe they were still there, still sleeping through the morning that wasn't morning. Maybe they'd wake and find him gone. He laughed once, quietly. It didn't sound like laughter. The stone hadn't moved. Neither had he. Yet the world, for all its stillness, felt like it was turning beneath him. A memory surfaced, sharp, uninvited. A graveside years ago, real, ordinary, a friend. Rain through black umbrellas, the sound of dirt hitting wood, that smell. He thought graves marked endings, but this one felt like the start of something. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the reflection. His voice came out barely above a breath. "What do you want?" The water shivered, not from wind, from something deeper. He flinched, but didn't move. He waited. He listened. Then, from the stillness, a sound. Faint, distant, unmistakable, like someone whispering from beneath the surface. It sounded almost like his own voice. Amberville, Chapter 6, continued. The Gravestone and the Lake. Raffi sat down. His legs gave out before he realized he was falling, the mud soft beneath him, damp seeping through his clothes. He didn't care. The air felt thin, almost metallic in his lungs, and his heart wouldn't slow down. He stared across the water, at the stone with his name carved into it, and tried to think of something rational, something small enough to hold in his mind. The smell of smoke from last night's fire, the sound of Daphne's laugh, the way the stars had looked before sleep. But each thought broke apart before it could settle. The lake kept swallowing them. He rubbed his face with both hands. "This isn't real," he said, but the words came out dull, unconvincing. He'd said them before, hadn't he? Back when the forest had felt wrong, when the nights had stretched too long. And every time, something had heard him. Now, the lake seemed to be listening again. He watched its surface, smooth and endless. The gravestone's reflection shimmered faintly, the letters beneath the water flexing, bending, reshaping, his name distorting into something that looked almost like language, but not quite human. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. The sight pinned him. He thought of the others back at camp, or what he hoped was still camp. The trees had shifted. The air felt older. Maybe they were still there, still sleeping through the morning that wasn't morning. Maybe they'd wake up and find him gone. He laughed once, quietly. It didn't sound like laughter. The stone hadn't moved. Neither had he. The world, for all its stillness, felt like it was turning beneath him. A memory rose up then, sharp and uninvited. Standing at a gravesite years ago, real and ordinary, a friend. Rain falling through black umbrellas, the sound of dirt hitting wood, that smell. He'd thought back then that graves marked endings, but this one felt like the start of something. He leaned forward until his elbows rested on his knees, eyes locked on the reflection. His voice came out barely above a breath. "What do you want?" The water shivered. Not from wind, from something deeper. It was enough to make him flinch, but he didn't move.
He waited. He listened.
Then, from the stillness, a sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Like someone whispering from beneath the surface.
It sounded almost like his own voice. Amberville, Chapter 7. Today, things changed. Horror realism rewrite, layered and explicit. The morning didn't come so much as ooze into being. A gray sky pressed low over the treetops, heavy with the smell of old rain and burned wood. Everything felt swollen. The tents, the air, the damp earth breathing steam as it tried to rot. Jerry was the first to stir. Her movement broke the silence like a knife dragged through wet cloth. She pushed herself upright, hair matted to her forehead, eyes clouded but still trying to remember what awake meant.
"Morning," she said.
The word sounded wrong. Dry, rehearsed, the voice of someone repeating a memory. Daphne hunched near the kettle, fingers red and raw from the cold, her nails rimmed in soot. "Hey, you're finally up." Her smile flickered once and vanished, like the effort had cost her. Mark muttered something about breakfast. Steve laughed, a shallow, breathless sound that died too soon. Raffi didn't speak. He watched the way the fog coiled through the trees, thick as smoke, and wondered if it had a direction. Jerry stretched. Her spine cracked audibly, each pop sharp as breaking glass. When she turned toward the fire, Raffi noticed something tiny but wrong. Her reflection in the dented metal of the kettle was half a beat behind her. He blinked. The image caught up. No one else noticed. The smell of damp canvas and extinguished ash filled the camp. The air had a taste, copper, mold, something metallic and old. The wind wasn't moving, but the trees swayed anyway. Leaves whispered though nothing touched them. Raffi rubbed his hands together for warmth, and when he pulled them apart, the skin on his palms made a faint tearing sound. The blisters from the hike yesterday had cracked open in the night. He stared at the faint smear of blood, the deep brown of it against the fog, and looked away quickly, embarrassed though no one had seen. "Coffee's ready," Daphne said. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the cold. They gathered by the fire. The flame was little more than a living ember, crawling over blackened wood. Mark reached in with a stick, stirred it once, and the smoke that rose was thick, greenish-gray. It smelled faintly like something burning that shouldn't. Steve coughed. "Jesus, what's in that?" Daphne frowned. "Just wood." But when she leaned closer, Raffi saw her recoil, not from heat, but from the smell. The fire didn't smoke upward. It rolled outward, hugging the ground, slinking across the soil like fog escaping a wound. No one said anything. Mark cracked open a beer, the sound sharp, too loud, slicing the silence in two. He held it out toward Raffi. "You look like hell." Yesterday, Raffi would have grinned, taken it, said something stupid. Today, he only stared at the can. The aluminum glinted wrong, wet but not from dew. A slick film clung to its surface, reflecting the fire in oily colors. He wanted to take it anyway, if only to feel human for a moment. He didn't. "Instead," he said, "we shouldn't stay here tonight." The air tightened. Even the insects stopped. Mark looked up. "What?" "Something's off." The words left him like blood from a wound, quick, unstoppable, irreversible. The moment they existed, the forest seemed to lean in. Steve forced a laugh. Off? We're just tired, man. Daphne's spoon paused mid-stir. Jerry's stick broke the spiral she'd been tracing in the dirt.
Raffi didn't look at him. You don't hear it?
Hear what? He gestured toward the woods. It's too quiet. No birds, no wind, just... He stopped. The silence was thicker now, pressing against the inside of his ears like pressure underwater. Mark sighed and sipped his beer. You're freaking yourself out. Maybe. But then he noticed something else. A faint, low vibration coming from beneath the dirt. A rhythmic pulse like the beat of a heart far too large to belong to anything alive. He crouched, pressed his hand to the ground. The mud quivered faintly beneath his fingers. Raffi, Daphne said softly, what are you doing? He didn't answer. The pulse came again. Thud, thud, thud. Each one slower than the last, but deeper, as though the earth itself was breathing. The sound rose into his bones. It hurt. He stood quickly, wiping his hand on his pants. The mud left a dark streak that shimmered faintly, like oil in water. Mark set down his beer. Hey, man. I'm fine, Raffi lied. They ate in silence after that. The coffee tasted wrong, bitter and mineral, like it had been brewed through rust. The sky never changed color. Time had stalled. By afternoon, the laughter came back. Forced at first, then easier. Mark telling a joke, Steve responding too loud, Daphne joining in. Jerry smiled again. Her teeth were too white in the gray light. The forest hummed. Raffi pretended to laugh along, but his eyes kept returning to Jerry. Her reflection in the kettle no longer lagged. Now it moved too fast, as though it couldn't wait for her. He blanked. The image stilled. He didn't check again. Later, the sound came back, deeper now, closer. The fire hissed as the ground trembled once, scattering ash into the air. Mark frowned. What was that? Steve laughed. Probably a truck on the highway. There was no highway, not for miles. Raffi looked at the lake through the trees. The water was perfectly flat, but the color had changed. It wasn't gray anymore. It was the color of bone soaked too long in shadow. The air around the campfire pulsed. Not wind, breath. The smell of rot moved with it, faint but growing. Jerry hummed softly under her breath. The same tune she'd hummed before, only now it was slower. Wrong. Raffi looked at her. Her eyes were open, but her pupils had dilated until her irises were almost gone. She smiled without noticing. He turned away. The forest shifted again. Not sound, but movement. The trunks seemed closer. The fog moved between them like liquid muscle. He whispered, "This isn't memory." Mark looked up. What? This isn't exhaustion or guilt or dream. Raffi's voice cracked. This is really happening. The fire went out. The smoke rose, black this time, thick and sweet, smelling like burned flesh. And from somewhere deep under the ground, the pulse
answered back. Thud, thud, thud. Amberville, Chapter 8. When the world forgot to move. The light didn't change. At first, Raffi thought it was his eyes adjusting too slowly, a trick of exhaustion. But after a while, the shadows stayed the same length, nailed to the dirt. The air was swollen, damp, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have lost its nerve. Daphne stirred the kettle. The spoon made no sound. Jerry's humming wandered between notes, never quite landing on any of them. Mark sat cross-legged by the fire, blinking in slow motion, the muscles in his face working like he'd forgotten how to use them. Raffi watched. The world looked preserved, as if the forest had been dipped in resin. Nothing shifted, not a leaf, not a breath. Even the smoke from the fire climbed upward in a single, unmoving column. "Do you hear that?" Raffi asked. Nobody answered. He waited. The question hung there too long. Then Steve said, without looking up, "Hear what?" "That," Raffi said, nothing." Steve laughed once, but it came out dry, splintered, the sound of old wood breaking. "You're tired, man. Get some water." Raffi did. He crouched by the canteen, twisting the cap. The water inside didn't move. It was solid, like glass pretending to be liquid. When he tilted the container, the contents shifted too slowly, as if time itself had to think about it first. He dropped it. The canteen hit the ground soundlessly. He looked up at the others. None of them had flinched. By afternoon, the light was the same. Gray, flavorless, a sky that had forgotten how to be day. The air tasted metallic now. Every breath carried a trace of rain that never came. Mark was pacing in small, repeated circles. Daphne stared into the trees, her lips moving like she was whispering to something. Jerry had stopped humming, but her fingers kept twitching against her knee, a silent rhythm too deliberate to be random. Raffi tried to speak. "We need to—" His voice cracked. It wasn't emotion. It was resistance. The sound itself didn't want to exist here. They all turned to him at once. Their eyes looked wrong. Not blank, not empty, but too aware. "What?" Mark asked. Raffi hesitated. "We should move. Go back to the car. Just get out of here." Jerry smiled faintly. "You said that yesterday." Raffi frowned. "What?" "You said that yesterday," she repeated, still smiling. "You wanted to leave before nightfall." He looked around. "Yesterday?" Steve nodded. "Yeah, man, you don't remember?" There was no night. There hadn't been any night. The light had never changed. Raffi stood. "You're lying." Mark snorted. "Jesus, Raff, calm down." I'm, he started, but stopped himself. The forest was breathing again. A low vibration ran through the ground, faint but constant, like a pulse buried deep under the dirt. The same beat he'd felt in his chest since the first morning. Thud, 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 thud. Daphne turned toward the sound before anyone else. Her head tilted slowly, her expression blank. "Do you feel that?" she asked, but it wasn't really a question. Raffi grabbed her arm. "Don't!" Her skin was ice cold. "It's calling,"
she said softly.
What is?
She looked past him, through him, toward the trees. The lake.
The word landed like a stone.
Rafi tightened his grip.
You're tired. Sit down. But she didn't hear him. Her body went rigid, then loose again, her muscles remembering some rhythm he couldn't follow. When she smiled, her lips split slightly at the corners. The blood was thin, watery, almost black.
"Daphne," he whispered.
She blinked, slowly, like waking from a dream. It remembers us. Then she turned toward the trees and began to walk.
Text.
The others watched without a word. Her movements were steady, deliberate. The fog seemed to part for her, not dispersing, but bending around her like skin. Rafi ran after her, branches slapping his face, the taste of copper in his mouth. Stop! She didn't. The trees opened into a clearing. The lake was waiting. It was impossibly still, the surface unbroken, reflecting nothing. Daphne! She stepped into the water. The ripples spread, but not like they should have. They moved in patterns, slow, perfect circles that never collided, never faded. Rafi splashed in after her, the cold shocking up his legs. Stop! You're not... She turned to look at him, smiling that same cracked smile. Her eyes were calm. I have to go, she said. Then she walked forward, deeper, until the water reached her chest, her throat, her chin. Please, Rafi said. She whispered something, too quiet to catch, and the surface folded over her. No splash, no bubbles, just stillness. Rafi fell to his knees, gasping, his hands submerged in the same cold glass that had taken her. He waited for a ripple, a sign, anything. Nothing. Behind him, Jerry's voice trembled. Where did she go? He turned. They were all standing at the shore now, motionless, watching the lake. She's gone, he said. You saw... Mark frowned. Saw what? Rafia's mouth went dry. She... But the words died. They were staring at him like he was speaking another language. Jerry blinked slowly. Rafi, she was never here. The lake pulsed once. A ripple touched his boots. He looked down. For a heartbeat, his reflection smiled. And then the world forgot to move again. Amberville, Chapter 9. The lake takes its time. At first, no one screamed. They only stood there, like figures painted into the wrong world. The lake lay before them, blank, unmoving, vast. Daphne was gone. No splash, no ripple, no proof she had ever existed, except for a faint smear of wet footprints that stopped just shy of the waterline. Rafi stood with his hands clenched at his sides, his breath catching on the edge of panic. The air pressed down on him, damp, heavy, without sound. He could hear his own heartbeat too clearly. He wanted someone, anyone, to speak. She probably wandered off, Mark said finally, though his voice trembled. He was staring at the lake, but wouldn't meet its reflection. Into the water? Rafi's voice broke the silence like glass. Mark didn't answer.
Steve shuffled his feet, eyes darting between them. "Maybe she slipped," he said. "The mud's soft."
Jerry shook her head, arms tight around herself. "Let's just get back to the car. We can find her from there."
Raffi opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again. He looked back at the lake, smooth, still, without a single breath of wind, and followed them into the trees.
The forest. The path was wrong.
It was the same direction they'd come from, but the turns didn't line up anymore. The trees pressed closer together, their branches hooking into each other like knotted fingers. The ground was thick with mud, slick with black water that pooled where the roots broke the surface. Every step sank with a wet sigh. Steve cursed as his shoe was sucked halfway off. This wasn't here before. "Keep moving," Mark said, breathing hard. "We're close." But close stretched into an hour, then 2, or maybe more. Time slid out of reach. The air felt stale, as if it hadn't been replaced in days. The fog clung to their backs and hair like a living thing.
"Mark," Jerry said softly, "do you remember how far the road was?"
15 minutes, he said, without turning around. That was an hour ago. He didn't answer. Raffi stumbled, catching himself against a tree. The bark was slick beneath his hand, damp and cold like flesh. When he looked down, his palm came away streaked with greenish-black residue. He rubbed it off on his jeans, but the stain clung. The forest smelled wrong. Not earthy, not wet, more like metal or something rotting under the surface of clean air. His tongue tasted it when he breathed. Then he noticed their footprints weren't behind them anymore. The mud filled itself in, smoothing over each print as if the forest refused to remember. Ta! The vanishing road. When they finally broke through the trees, the road wasn't there. It should have been a narrow gravel strip cutting between the woods and the lake. But the clearing had changed. The ground sloped downward into shallow reeds. Beyond that was only more water, stretching endlessly.
Mark froze.
No, it was here. The car was right here. He waded forward, boots squelching. "I parked right," he pointed, then stopped, because there was nothing to point to. Jerry's voice cracked. "We're going in circles." "No," Raffi said quietly, "we're not." Mark turned, wild-eyed. "Then where the hell are we?" Raffi swallowed hard. The air around them felt too thick to speak through. "We never left the lake." They stood there, breathing in the stillness, until Steve let out a shaky laugh that bordered on hysteria. "You're nuts! Look!" He gestured toward the fog. "The road's probably just—"
A low vibration shuddered through the ground.
It was faint at first, like a truck far off in the distance. Then stronger, closer. The mud trembled under their feet. Ripples spread through shallow puddles, though there was no wind to move them.
"What the hell was that?" Jerry whispered.
Raffi didn't answer. He knew the rhythm. He'd felt it before.
Thud. 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 Thud.
Like a heartbeat, but coming from beneath the soil.
Running. Lightning flashed.
Not from above, but from somewhere under the forest floor. A pale glow that cracked across the fog, illuminating their faces in stuttering fragments. For an instant, Raffi saw them clearly. Mark's clenched jaw, Steve's eyes wide with fear, Jerry's lips moving in silent prayer. Then, darkness again. "Move!" Mark shouted, already running. "Run!" They did. Branches tore at their arms, the fog swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Rafia's lungs burned. Every breath was wet, heavy. The ground seemed to pulse underfoot, like the earth was breathing in sync with their panic. Something crashed behind them, a heavy, wet sound, followed by a splash. Jerry screamed. Raffi turned just in time to see Steve stumble into the fog. "Steve!" No answer. Just the echo of his name bouncing back in a whisper that wasn't his own. Raffi pushed forward, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The world flickered again, light from nowhere, searing white, revealing a smear of red across a tree trunk before vanishing. "Keep going!" Mark yelled, but his voice cracked halfway through. Raffi caught Jerry's arm, pulling her through the tangle of roots. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. "He's gone," she whispered. "Steve's." "Don't say it!" They stumbled into a clearing. For a moment, it was silent again. No wind, no sound, just the ringing absence of everything. Then Mark fell to his knees. Tension.
Mark's breakdown.
He was shaking, his hands clawing at the mud. "It's not real," he muttered. "It's not real. It's not—" "Mark!" Jerry started, but he cut her off with a strangled cry. "It's a trick! It's all a—" He slammed his fists into the dirt. The sound was muffled, dull. The ground beneath him was soft, too soft. It gave slightly, then hardened again. Raffi knelt beside him. "We'll find a way out, just—" "Out?" Mark laughed. A cracked, broken laugh that ended in a sob. "There's no out. We've been walking for hours, and we're still here. The lake's everywhere." Jerry backed away, eyes wide. "Stop shouting!" "Why? You think it cares?" Mark screamed. His voice tore through the silence like a wound. The forest answered. A low, rolling sound. Not thunder, not wind, but something between. It rose from the ground, humming through the air, shaking the leaves without moving them. Raffi felt it in his teeth, his bones, the spaces between his thoughts. "Mark!" Raffi reached out, but it was too late. The ground split with a sound like wet fabric tearing. Light spilled out, cold, white, pulsing. Mark's scream was brief, cut short as the fog folded over him. When it cleared, he was gone. The crack in the ground sealed itself, leaving nothing but the faint smell of salt and smoke. The clearing. Jerry's sobs broke the silence. She fell against Raffi, trembling. He just... Raffi held her, but his own arms felt numb. "We have to keep moving." They staggered through the trees, following no path. The forest blurred, identical in every direction. Their legs were raw, clothes soaked, skin slick with cold sweat. When Jerry tripped, Raffi caught her by reflex. She was shaking uncontrollably. "I can't," she whispered. "Please, I can't." "Just a little farther," he said, though he didn't believe it. They found another clearing, smaller this time, ringed by trees that leaned inward like listening faces. The fog here was thinner, tinted with faint silver. Jerry sank to her knees, gasping, "Just for a minute, please." Raffi nodded. He sat beside her, the mud sucking softly around his boots. The silence pressed in from all sides. It was so complete it felt like a sound in itself, a low pressure against the skull. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. When he opened them, Jerry was gone. No sound, no struggle, only the impression of her weight still pressed into the ground beside him. The grass slowly unbent where she'd been sitting. Raffi froze. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then he heard it, a faint, low laugh. It came from below him, from the soil itself. He pressed his hands into the dirt. It was warm, alive. He stumbled backward, choking on a sob that tasted like metal. Boo! The shore. He didn't remember walking, but the fog shifted and the lake was there again, impossibly close, as though it had never left. The surface glowed faintly with trapped light. Raffi stood at the edge, shaking. He could smell it now, a clean, sterile scent undercut with rot, like water that had been sealed away for centuries. His reflection stared back at him, breathing when he didn't. He sank to his knees, the mud cold and slick beneath his palms. "Why?" he whispered. The word came out raw, torn from somewhere deep. The water rippled once, deliberate, as though considering its answer. Then a voice, not heard, but felt, moved through him like current. "Because you stayed." He pressed a hand to his chest, but the heartbeat wasn't his anymore. It matched the rhythm beneath the ground. He looked back toward the trees. There were no trees now, only fog. The world had narrowed to this single point: him, the water, and the silence. Raffi leaned forward until his reflection filled his vision. Its mouth moved first. Then he understood. The lake had never taken them. It had been waiting for him. Amberville, Chapter 10. The Conundrum. The fog had lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, Raffi could see the sky, pale, washed-out gray, the color of old bruises. It wasn't morning or afternoon or anything, just light that existed because it had to. The lake stretched before him, vast and calm, the surface smoother than glass. Not a ripple, not a sound. Even the wind refused to disturb it. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there. His legs had gone numb. His fingers, raw from the cold, trembled against the mud. Every breath felt heavier than the one before, like his lungs were full of fog instead of air. He whispered again, to no one. Why? No answer came this time, just the sound of his own voice fading into the mist like a lie. Behind him, the forest was gone. Not vanished, erased. The trees no longer cast shadows, the ground no longer bore the weight of memory. The space where the others had stood was smooth, undisturbed, like nothing had ever happened there. It didn't feel like he had lost them. It felt like he had been edited. Shape rippled in the corner of his vision, something beneath the water, slow and deliberate. He didn't flinch, he just watched. For a moment, the reflection shifted. The trees came back, then the cabin, then faces, distorted, flickering. Daphne, Steve, Mark, Jerry.
each staring up from beneath the surface. Their eyes were open, unfocused. Their mouths were moving, but the water refused to let the sound escape.
Rafia's heartbeat faltered. "Stop," he whispered. "Please, stop."
The images dissolved, merging into a single pale shimmer that pulsed in time with his breath. He realized it wasn't the lake reflecting him.
It was the other way around.
He sank to his knees, hands shaking. His reflection watched from the water's edge, breathing when he thought of Daphne's calm before she walked into the lake, of Steve's scream that had ended too soon, of Mark's eyes when he realized he'd never leave, of Jerry's voice whispering, "It's okay." They had each accepted it before he could stop them. And now, the silence wanted him too. He felt it in his veins, that slow rhythm matching the lake's. The pulse wasn't inside him anymore. He was inside it. He stood. The world tilted slightly, like the earth had forgotten where to put him. The edge of the lake was only a few steps away. The water shimmered faintly, not with light, but memory. Faces drifted beneath the surface, faint and formless, like fish moving through dark glass. He thought he recognized one, Jerry, maybe, or himself. It didn't matter anymore. He took a breath that burned his lungs and stepped forward. The water didn't resist. The surface accepted his foot as if it had been waiting, a thin membrane parting with the sound of air leaving a lung. The cold hit instantly, sharp and pure, climbing up his legs like static. Half pain, half relief. The water felt wrong, not wet, but dense, pressing in from every direction. It was too heavy, too alive. Rafi waded deeper. Each step grew slower. His body felt distant, the signals delayed, as if the lake were learning him, mapping every nerve and breath. He reached his waist. The pressure built behind his eyes. His vision shimmered, bending the world into impossible shapes, sky folding over water, horizon turning inward, space collapsing. He thought he heard someone call his name, but it came from inside his chest. The voice was familiar, his own. "Stay, all right." He laughed again, choking on the sound. "I am," he said. "I'm here." He took another step, then another, until the water reached his ribs. His heartbeat was gone now. Only the lakes remained. The surface around him rippled outward in wide, slow circles, patterns too precise to be natural. The air smelled clean again, almost sweet. He thought he could taste rain on his tongue, though no storm had come. Rafi tilted his head back. The sky above him was motionless. Not a single cloud moved. He whispered, "What are you?" The answer came as a pulse through his spine. "You." He smiled, the expression too tired to mean anything. "Don't outside the tag." The water reached his throat. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw everything at once. The cabin, the forest, the laughter, the campfire. Daphne's smile, Jerry's hum, Steve's jokes, Mark's temper. All looping, perfectly preserved, replaying in slow, endless rhythm, like the lake's version of remembering. He took one more breath and stepped forward. The surface folded over his head. There was no struggle. The water did not pull or drag or fill his lungs. It simply closed around him, soundless, infinite. The cold became warmth. The pressure turned into release. When he opened his eyes, there was no light, only movement. Shapes drifted through the darkness, familiar silhouettes, slow and silent. Hands reaching, faces half recognized. Not corpses, not ghosts, echoes. They passed through him gently, and each one left a trace, a memory, a heartbeat, a whisper. He wasn't drowning. He was dissolving. The lake's rhythm overtook his own, steady and eternal. Above him, the surface quivered once, a small, perfect ripple that reached the farthest edge of the shore before fading into stillness. The world exhaled, and the lake took its